around a temperature target and trying to achieve emissions reductions to stay well below 2 degrees. So for the next half hour, I've identified 5 key trends from NEO 2020 that shape the future energy sector. And these findings, these trends, they come from both scenarios that we have produced in NEO 2020. Now, the emissions may have peaked in 2019. The second is the electricity sector is leading the energy transition thanks to cheap renewables. The third is the growth of electric vehicles leads to peak oil. The fourth is gas continues to grow, yet more slowly. And the fifth is electrification, hydrogen may be a path to stay below 2 degrees. And I'm going to go through those 5 trends now over the next half hour and give a little bit more detail about what we mean. So let's start with the first. Emissions may have peaked in 2019. And so this is really encouraging news. And two major factors may explain why emissions peaked in 2019. On the one hand, there's COVID-19, which led to a decline in emissions of an estimated 9.1% last year. And on the other hand, there is the ongoing switch to renewables in the power sector. Both factors combined lead to this peak that we have identified here. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to really call peaks, but that's what we suggest based on last year's analysis. And we expect a recovery of emissions over the next few years as the global economy recovers from the pandemic, but we do not think that this recovery is strong enough to reach historical levels again. If we look at the same picture from a fuels perspective, we see that coal is the largest source of emissions today, and it remains a significant contributor in the future. But we also see that the emissions of coal decline, and this is an interesting trend I want to look into a little bit in more detail. And what you see here is coal demand across different sectors for the global economy. And we think that coal demand has already peaked, namely a year earlier than global emissions in 2018. And this is thanks to a peak in coal use in the power sector. Today, power accounts for around 60% of coal use. So what the power sector does in terms of coal use is really, really important for global coal use, but also for global emissions. And there's also an important regional dynamic behind this. And what we see here is that China is by far the largest consumer of coal globally for power generation. But we also expect that within just 7 years, that the coal use for electricity generation in China may peak and then very quickly fall. We see a similar trend already underway in the United States and Europe. And in another major economy, India, we expect coal growth to significantly slow and then peak around 2030 and then somewhat decline, not as quickly as China, US, in Europe. If you put that on another scale just to show you the challenge, but also regionally where the challenge is, and it is really in China. What we see in terms of renewables deployment, the switch to renewables, China is really a leader. So China is, let's say, on the right way to reduce coal use and emissions from coal. Now, the second finding that I want to talk about is that the electricity sector is really the sector where the transition to cleaner energy is already underway, because there is an existing solution that makes economic sense, which is PV and wind. And what you see here is the economic transition scenario, so the economics-led scenario, and the generation mix of that scenario from today to 2050. We have a little bit of historical detail there as well. And what you see is that we are going from a global power system that is dominated by coal and gas and a little bit of oil, which make 62% of generation today, to a mix that is dominated by solar and wind. 56% of all electricity generation is solar and wind by 2050 in this scenario, and combined with other renewables reach 69% by 2050. So it's a very, very stark change from where we are today. And all of this, of course, needs power capacity. And we see in our analysis that global installed power capacity almost triples over the next 30 years, from 7.4 terawatts today to more than 20 terawatts in 2050. And again, you see this transition to renewables reflected in the installed capacity. Almost 60% of the installed capacity by 2050 comes from wind and solar, and the role of coal, gas, and oil really diminishes over the same time frame. If we look at this from an investment opportunity, then we estimate this to be a $15.1 trillion investment opportunity over the next 30 years. Most, again, comes from wind and solar, but there's also an opportunity for batteries. Around 6% of those 15.1 trillion can be utility scale or small scale batteries. There's also some investment in gas, especially in peaker plants that complement the variability of renewables. In terms of the regions that invest the most, we see APAC leading investments because it's where the biggest growth markets are, including China, India, but also Southeast Asia, followed by Europe, Middle East, and Africa, the Americas, and then rest of the world. Now, I want to come back to the underlying fundamentals of this scenario. And I said before that the ETS, the economic transition scenario, is really a scenario where we look at the costs of different energy technologies and try to strip out long-term policies or long-term targets that countries have. So what you've seen over the last few slides is really a reflection of the cost dynamics that we see in the power sector play out. And when we look at a global map here of what the cheapest technology is in different countries globally, we can see that in countries representing 3/4 of world GDP, renewables, that is either wind or PV, are already the cheapest form of new electricity. That means if there is growth in demand, it makes more sense to build on a benchmark level, if you compare benchmark costs, a wind plant, let's say in North America, than to continue to invest in gas. The same is true in many places in Europe, but also in Asia. Now, what I just described is the cost competitiveness of wind and PV on a new build basis, but there is also a second tipping point that we can identify. This tipping point describes when wind and PV start to undercut the running costs of coal and gas. So that means at one point it may make more sense to build a new onshore wind or PV plant rather than to continue running your coal or gas plant. And this is a very important phenomenon that can happen or already happens in some markets, because it really means that coal and gas plants start to run less because it is more expensive to do so rather than to build something new. And you see here an example for China where we think this tipping point, this crossover point, may happen within the next few years. And actually, our latest cost analysis from late 2020 suggests that this crossover point might already be happening or is very close. Another example is the United States here, where the competitiveness, or the most competitive form of power generation is combined cycle gas turbines. And similarly here, we expect on a benchmark level onshore wind and PV to start undercutting gas. Now, this is a great story for renewables because they are very cheap, and as you have seen in my first slide on electricity generation, they really reach very high levels globally. But there's also a limit to PV and wind that we see in our analysis, and we think it is around 70 to 80% of electricity generation. And why is there this limit? On the one hand, there might be other sources of generation like hydro, but also a cheap natural gas that stays in the system for flexibility and for backup. But there's also other factors that let's say limit the potential of PV and wind a little bit, which is the seasonality, for example, but it is also the daily variation of wind and PV output. So for the morning hours, for the evening hours, or for cold winters in Europe, economies, power systems will need a complement to renewables, even though they are on a bulk basis the cheapest forms of power generation over the next 30 years. Now, the third key trend I want to discuss is electric vehicles and their role for oil demand. Now, we see a peak in oil demand in 2035, and this coincides with when road transport reaches its maximum use of oil. At the same time, we see continued growth in aviation, shipping, feedstock, and petrochemicals. But those sectors do not, the growth in those sectors is not strong enough to halt the overall decline of oil demand from around 2035 onwards. And we expect around a 0.7% drop year on year from 2035 to 2050. And oil demand should reach around 2018 levels by 2050. Now, I said that road transport and electric vehicles are really important for the global oil story. And what you see here is that the electric vehicles sales are really going to increase over the next 30 years. By 2050, on a global level, we expect that 73% of all new passenger vehicle sales will be or are electric vehicles. And if you look at this from a total fleets perspective, that translates into around 54% of all cars on the road in 2050 being electric. And of course, there is variation in different regions. For example, in Europe, the US, and China, we expect sales of electric vehicles to be higher than on the global average level, ranging between 56 to 80%. Now, similar to the power story, the renewable story in power, it is a question of cost that is really driving that switch to electric vehicles. And what you see on this chart here is the evolution of battery pack prices since 2010 to 2019 and then to 2030. And what we have observed in our studies is that since 2010, costs have dropped from more than $1,000 per kilowatt hour to around $150 per kilowatt hour in 2019. And we expect the cost of lithium-ion battery pack prices to further decline over the next 10 years, namely to $61 per kilowatt hour. It is really that decline in battery packs that makes electric vehicles a competitor or an economic alternative to internal combustion engines. And you see that on this chart here, on this illustration, which suggests that by the mid-2020s, electric vehicles should reach upfront price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles in most segments. And what do I mean with upfront price parity? That basically means you go to a retailer, you would like to buy a car, and the price tag of vehicle, of an electric vehicle, is comparable to one that has an internal combustion engine. And again, this is driven by the decline in battery packs, which you see on this chart, continues to decline. Now, key finding for gas continues to grow, yet more slowly. I'm just going to quickly look at time. Okay, still doing okay. Gas is the only fuel that we see continue to grow in our economic transition scenario, namely by around 0.5% year on year to 2050. And there's basically the building sector that we think is the strongest driver of growth. There's a little bit of growth in the power sector as well initially, but then it starts to fade post 2030. We see relatively little growth in industry. And if we look at the building sector in more detail, we see growth of 33%, and most of this is driven by population and GDP, especially in emerging economies where population and GDP grow more quickly than in developed countries, and their gas continues to be an attractive and economic way of heating homes and provide other forms of energy in buildings. Now, in the power sector, there is an interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, there is growth in power capacity, as you can see on this chart, most of which in the next 10 years comes from combined cycle gas turbines, in the long term from peaker gas plants. These are plants that support renewables when they are not operating, when they need backup. So that is the one side of the coin, if you want, in the power sector. But on the other hand, we expect fuel burn gas fuel burn in the power sector to fall, especially from 2030 onwards. And this translates into a fall of the capacity factors of CCGT power plants. And you see that on the right-hand side chart here. We're moving from an average global capacity factor of around 27%, or 46% in 2019, to around 27% by 2050. And again, this reflects the changing role of gas in power, being a provider of bulk electricity to being a provider of flexibility and backup as renewables become the cheapest form of electricity provision. And now finally, the fifth key trend, electrification and hydrogen may be a path to stay below 2 degrees. And I want to come back to this chart that I showed you in the beginning, which I said is encouraging news because it means that, or it meant that emissions may have peaked and that we are on a path to declining emissions to 2050. Yet this decline is not enough to stay below 2 degrees or anywhere where the Paris Climate Agreement suggests we should be. So if we wanted to reach 2 degrees by 2050 and thereafter, emissions would need to drop by 6% year on year. That is 9 times faster than where we are headed based on economics alone. And if we wanted to reach 1.5 degrees, this is a completely different challenge, a very, very difficult challenge, and it would require a 10% emission reduction over every year to 2050. Now, what we propose in our new climate scenario is a pathway to reach 1.75 degrees. And there's 2 main solutions we propose in this pathway. The first one is electrification, and the second one is green hydrogen. And this is really a pathway that explores those two solutions, rather than to predict or suggest that this is necessarily where the world is headed. Of course, there's other solutions out there, but we had for the new climate scenario in 2020, we chose those two vectors of decarbonization. Now, I want to start with electrification because it is an existent and economic way of decarbonization. It is also a much more efficient way to consume energy because it is highly efficient. Electric motors tend to be a much more efficient way of consuming energy compared to motors that consume fuels. And similarly, in the power sector, as we are switching from fossil fuels to renewables, we're basically making the power sector a more efficient sector, as we tend to waste less fossil fuels in the conversion from actual fuels to electricity. So this is one reason why we chose electrification as one vector of decarbonization. If you think about transport, especially road transport with electric vehicles, it is an already existing solution to decarbonize. And of course, if we wanted to, there is much more that we can do. Similarly, in the building sector, there is potential for electrification. So now, what does that all mean? If we wanted to be more ambitious on electrification, it would mean an increase of electricity generation in 2050 from around 42,000 terawatt hours to more than 66,000 terawatt hours in 2050. And that means a doubling of capacity, and this is what you see on these charts here, a doubling of capacity relative to our economic transition scenario, from around 21 terawatts installed in 2050 to more than 40 terawatts in 2050, much of which is PV and wind, but we also expect hydrogen to play a role as a backup solution in power. Now, the second lever that we're proposing in this climate scenario is green hydrogen. And the really interesting story about green hydrogen is that the costs of the technology are falling really quickly. On the one hand, there is electrolyzers, and we see a convergence of cheap Chinese electrolyzers with Western electrolyzers in the coming decades. And at the same time, the cost of renewables fall. And that means that over the next 10 years, we expect the levelized cost of green hydrogen production measured in dollars per kilogram to significantly drop to around $1 to around $3 of a range, depending on where you produce the green hydrogen in the world. And by 2050, there should be some countries that are able to produce green hydrogen for about $0.50 per kilogram. But again, there is somewhat of a range. And again, this is driven by the decline in electrolyzer and renewable energy cost. So this decline in green hydrogen production suggests that it can be a solution for complementing electrification wherever electrification may not be the optimal solution. And you can think about heavy industry, for example, where you might need, where you have high heat requirements and where electricity or an electric process might not be the most economic solution. You can see steel production, for example, but also cement. In the power sector, as you saw, there is a role for hydrogen, but also in transport, especially in long haul commercial transport with heavy trucks. So all in all, that leads us to around 800 megatons of hydrogen demand by 2050.
Matthias, I think we'll have to speed it up as we got about, I would imagine, another minute or two.
Okay.
Otherwise I'll get in trouble.
All right, understood. So I'll just quickly go over this. Of course, green hydrogen production means more electricity production by 2050, around 100,000 terawatt hours to produce the green hydrogen. And if you look what this suggests for oil and gas demand, it is really a peak much sooner than in the ETS. And by 2050, that should get us to 1.75 degrees. And yeah, these were the 5 key findings I wanted to share with you. Ashley, I don't know if we have time for questions, but otherwise I'm happy to leave it here.
Yes, you did very, very well. There's a lot to cover. I'd like to ask one question from the audience. It'd be unfair not to. Apologies to the others that haven't had theirs answered. But Jose asked, why do you think Japan, China, and the likes will lag substantially far behind Europe for wind and PV penetration in the future?
Well, if we start with China, China is the biggest investor of renewables today. So China is already doing a lot, but at the same time, it is a very, very quickly growing economy. That means in terms of electricity demand, it is facing a very, very different challenge compared to the US or Europe, where electricity demand continues to grow, while in the US and Europe, it is stagnating or only slowly increasing. So it is really a question about growth. And then for Japan, and I think you mentioned Korea, it is a little bit a land use question in our analysis. If you think about Japan, it is a very mountainous country with much less land availability for wind and PV, and that translates into the cost of PV and wind, which we see in Japan and Korea to be significantly higher than in Europe and other places that fall as well. But there is a premium to those to the costs in those economies.
Fantastic, Matthias. Thank you so much. I think it's a great introduction to the summit. To those that have asked questions, we've been able to answer them. I'll take it offline with Matthias and we'll answer them and make sure that the CEBC get those answers to you, and we'll probably post them on the chat. Thank you very much. Enjoy the summit.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
So Mary, just one last time, it's Mary, right?
Vari. Like
Mary, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hope you can hear me. Good
Yes.
morning.
Good morning.
Dalia, how is the quality of sound and video?
I can hear you and see you very well.
Great.
Yeah.
Rajat, your camera is off.
Shut the door.
No, Rajit, we cannot hear you or see you. All right, I think we are live. So good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for one of our panelists to solve some technical issues. Okay, we see you now.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank God. Hi Sunil, hi Mohammed, hi Wari.
Hello. Always on time, Rajit.
Morning.
Sunil, I'm gonna now save the yelling for a face-to-face meeting. I finished my quota while you couldn't see me.
All right, so we are live and we are starting now. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm very pleased to be with such an esteemed, excellent panel to discuss the challenges and opportunities for clean energy in the MENA region. So before this, I will just introduce myself very quickly. My name is Diala Hawila. I work in the International Renewable Energy Agency in the policy analysis. So I will just give a brief introduction of the panel, and then I will introduce my esteemed panelists, and then we will get into the discussion. So as we saw now, the presentation from Matthias from BNEF, Matthias presented a scenario for 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. But at IRENA, we are looking at the World Energy Transitions Outlook that looks at a 1.5 degree scenario. So in this 1.5 degree scenario, the total final energy consumption needs to decrease from by around 8%. All of the efforts should focus on energy conservation and efficiency, on renewable energy, on electrification, green hydrogen, and other solutions. So when we look at renewable energy, first of all, electrification, the share of electricity in the mix increases from 21% to 51% as we make more efforts to electrify end uses such as heating and cooling and transport. So in the IRENA scenario, 90% of this electricity comes from renewables. And for hard to abate sectors such as transport and industry, we have sustainable bioenergy and hydrogen are deployed, accounting for 18% and 12% of the total final consumption. 66% of the hydrogen comes from renewables. So this transition in IRENA scenario requires a total investment in transition-related solutions such as renewables, energy efficiency, and end-use electrification, power grids, flexibility, innovation, and carbon removal measures of around $4 trillion per year until 2050. Now, BNEF's analysis suggests that around $500 billion was invested in 2020. So we have to move from $500 billion in 2020 to $4 trillion per year until 2050. Now, out of the $500 billion invested in 2020, the MENA region attracted less than 12 billion. So the MENA region attracted them less than 12 billion of a total of 500 billion globally. And a lot of this is concentrated in a handful of countries, such as, for example, the UAE. The momentum has also picked up in Saudi Arabia. And both countries are major oil producers. The region has around 60% of the world's oil reserves and 45% of the world's natural gas reserves. And the oil and gas sector constitutes a considerable share of revenues and plays a crucial role in the economy, including job creation. So as the world embarks on the energy transition, provisions need to be made to ensure that this is a just transition. And for the transition to be successful, it must leave no one behind. In some countries with looming political and economic crises in the region and instability, the energy can bring considerable hope. The potential for energy security, creation of new industries, job creation in a region with an average 25% of youth unemployment rate are very, very meaningful. But so far, these countries have not been able to create an enabling environment to attract investments. So our discussion today will be structured into 2 main parts. The first part will focus on countries where the clean energy sector has kicked off, where the perceived risks in some technologies, mainly those related to power, have gone down. And we are looking into the future, into new technologies to take the transition even further, such as green hydrogen and electric mobility. And then we will go to the second part of the discussion, which will focus on countries that are still lagging behind in their transitions, where the transition is much needed for energy security, socioeconomic development, and jobs. But in these countries, are still too high. And then at the end, we will take some questions from the audience, and we will summarize main takeaways for the region as a whole. So joining me today for this discussion is an excellent panel that I am honored to moderate. We will hear from two of the largest developers in the region, Masdar and ACWA Power, one of the main banks, Standard Chartered, and a prominent international law firm, Dentons. So I will start with introducing the panel. Joining us today is Mr. Mohammed Abdelkader Al-Rahami. He's the Director for Asset Management and Technical Services in the Clean Energy Division of Abu Dhabi's renewable energy company, Masdar. In his capacity, he is the focal point of stakeholder management and interface with all utilities and service providers, leading all of Masdar's initiatives related to water and sustainability and playing a key role in shaping the regulatory framework for the energy sector in Abu Dhabi and the UAE. He's working to enhance the performance of Masdar utility investments, joint ventures, special purpose vehicles, through effective and efficient governance to support the company's overall strategy. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you, Dalia.
Also with us today, we have Mr. Rajit Nanda, the Chief Portfolio Management Officer and Acting Chief Investment Officer of ACWA Power. With more than 25 years of experience, he is responsible for ACWA Power's growth and remains functionally in charge of new business development, legal projects, acquisitions, and divestitures, and corporate and project finance. Welcome, Mr. Rajit. We have also with us Mr. Sunil Koshal, he was the regional CEO of Standard Chartered Africa and the Middle East, and a member of Standard Chartered's global management team, the highest executive body within the bank. In March, Sunil was appointed as global advisor for MoneyTap. He has been with the group for nearly 23 years and has approximately 33 years of banking experience in diverse markets across North Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Sunil has held senior roles across wholesale, retail, SME bankers, and country management within the group. We're very pleased to have you with us, Sunil.
Thank you for having me.
And last but not least, we have Ms. Vary Main Garcia. She is a partner in the energy team in the international law firm Dentons in the Middle East Regional Head of Energy, Transport, and Infrastructure. Vary also serves as vice chair of the board of the Clean Energy Business Council. She is corporate and commercial lawyer specializing in energy and infrastructure projects, advising on project development and M&A in the energy and infrastructure sectors. She has passion for renewables and clean energy, working on projects across the Middle East and North Africa. She focuses in particular on advising on utilities projects, including renewables projects, solar utility, PV, CSP, and CNI, waste to energy, and wind, in addition to advising on conventional water, wastewater, and district heating and cooling projects. So I'm very excited with this panel, and we will start the discussion today with Mr. Mohammed. So, Mohammed, what are the latest developments of Masdar in the region in terms of renewable energy projects? And has the pandemic impacted your activities on the ground in any way?
Well, thank you, Dalia. To start with the end of the pandemic, in sight comes the promise of global green recovery. We know that with much of the world looking at significant infrastructure spending to kickstart their economies post-pandemic, this represents an unprecedented opportunity for us in Masdar, where our purpose, our mission, and our mandate have never been more relevant. You know, as we celebrate the 15th anniversary this year, we are proud to say that Masdar is one of the fastest growing renewable companies in the world, with a footprint in more than 30 countries. In the year of the pandemic and the year before, 2019 and 2020, we have doubled our capacity, investing or committing to invest in projects with a combined value of $20 billion and generating capacity of a gross 11 gigawatt, displacing over around 16 million tons of CO2 per year. Starting from our flagship project in Masdar city back in 2009, when we commissioned our 10 megawatt photovoltaic, which was a pioneering project at that time, commencing to our Shams CSP project in the western region with 100 megawatt capacities, 768 parabolic trough collectors. These pushed the boundaries of innovations, of commercial deployment, financial restructuring, for us to spread our wings and deploy a much larger projects. Swihan project of 1.17 gigawatt, the latest record-breaking Al Dhafra PV project of 2 gigawatt at $1.3 per kilowatt hour, pushing the frontiers of other technologies in addition to solar and wind. We've partnered with BIA in Sharjah with the very first waste-to-energy project here in the UAE, 300,000 metric tons of solid municipal waste to produce clean energy from waste. Also in mid-2020, we have inaugurated the third phase of Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Solar Park. Phase 3 comprised of 800 megawatts and is part of what is to be the largest single-site solar park in the world, with planned capacity of around 5 gigawatt by the year 2030. In addition to that, we've expanded to the region in Saudi Arabia. We have the Jeddah PV project of 300 megawatt. Masdar and EDF Renewable announced back in 2019 that we've won the tender of Domat Al Jandal in Saudi Arabia with an installed capacity of 402 megawatt. That will be Saudi Arabia's first wind farm and the largest in the Middle East. Also in Oman, prior to that, we have commissioned a 50 megawatt wind project in Dhofar region, where it was the first investment in Oman's renewable energy sector.
Thank you very much. This is very impressive. And as an ex-Masdar student myself, I went to university in Masdar Institute and lived in Masdar city. And we're very pleased to see the projects continuing and Masdar continuing to grow and to lead these projects in the region. So moving away from power, so we see all these achievements in power. And one of your previous interviews, you have stated that because of the solar abundance and high radiation of solar here in the Middle East, green hydrogen will be produced at lowest cost possible internationally. And we saw Matthias presented some of the forecasts for costs moving forward for green hydrogen, which gives you the chance to play a primary role in hydrogen generally and green hydrogen particularly. In January, Masdar signed an MOU with Abu Dhabi Department of Energy, Etihad Airways, and many other big players to support the development of Abu Dhabi's green hydrogen sector. Can you tell us more about that? And aside from the abundance of solar resources, what makes the UAE a key player in green hydrogen? If you can give us a bit more examples about the enabling environment of the UAE, what enables us to go into innovation in this sector?
Exactly. UAE is not only a place where photovoltaic is being produced reliably at the lowest cost in the world. We're pushing the boundaries of $1 per kilowatt hour. Nonetheless, with the current structure that the Abu Dhabi Hydrogen Alliance, which I will explain in a minute, we have provided a platform where we are leveraging R&D, we're leveraging the existing infrastructure, policies, procedures that supports innovation to push the boundaries of hydrogen into the new era. And I don't know if you are aware, Masdar was one of the very first pioneers who started looking at hydrogen production back in 2008. You know, when I first joined Masdar, there was the HPAD project, which was presented to the Executive Council for approval. And at that time, we thought that this was a little too far ahead of the curve. We are really ahead of everyone else in the international community. Now we feel the time is really right to accelerate investment into the hydrogen spectrum. We are ready in hydrogen to build the very first large-scale demonstrator plant that will show the potential viability of green hydrogen, focusing on the different spectrums of the sustainable fuel products that address, for example, green diesel and green kerosene. You must have heard about DEWA launching the green hydrogen project recently. Our project has a much wider variety of products, and it's 15 times larger in capacity. So this puts it in scale, because we know that now, as we speak, the hydrogen industry is capital intensive. And for green hydrogen, which is currently still expensive, for it to make sense commercially, we need to accelerate the growth and development where we can achieve commercial critical mass. And that's key. When it comes to the hydrogen industry as the future of what we call the alternative fuel moving forward, we expect that the green hydrogen by itself, we know that there is gray, there is blue. If we take the green hydrogen itself, which we in Masdar believe is the future, we expect it to reach around 530 million metric tons by the year 2050. That would displace around 10.4 billion barrels of oil equivalent. 10.5 billion barrels, that's around 37% of the pre-pandemic global oil production. The green hydrogen export market could be worth up to around $300 billion yearly by the year 2050, creating around 500,000 jobs globally in renewable energy and hydrogen production. Now, the Abu Dhabi has created a platform that would look at the hydrogen holistically, that would bring all the value chain and value proposition on the table. This trilateral agreement that was signed back in January with ADNOC, Mubadala, and ADQ has set the scene for us to push boundaries of that entire spectrum of hydrogen. Following that, we have created a consortium that started with 5, then 7, now we are 12 entities. We have Masdar, Siemens, Marubeni, we have Etihad, Lufthansa, Khalifa University to bring in the R&D and innovation, the Abu Dhabi Department of Economic Development, OMV, and the list keeps growing and growing. And with this holistic approach, we will adopt the fastest and most reliable approach, whereby we can commercialize hydrogen and take it into the new frontiers of liberal economy of scale and competitiveness to other fuels. If you, for example, look in particularly on the green kerosene, we expect that to become at liberal economy of scale competitive around the year 2030, and the market will even grow larger and larger as we speak.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Green hydrogen will be very important for this region. As we mentioned, as we transition, we want to make sure that the transition is fair economically. So in this region, we can move from abundant oil and gas resources, and we have a lot that can be used to produce green hydrogen in terms of solar resources, availability of land, infrastructure that we can leverage on, for example, maybe pipelines that can be redirected, etc. So we look forward, and also it goes well with the vision of the region to be a knowledge-based economy. So it goes well with the vision of innovation and looking into the future.
Indeed.
So thank you very much. We will now move to another main developer in the region, Mr. Rajit. We will also, if you can tell us about the main developments of ACWA Power in the region these days, and also give us a bit of how the pandemic has impacted your activities on the ground in any way.
Yeah, good morning, Diala. Good morning, all my fellow panelists, and also to the viewers. Before I respond to you, I think, let me just share a quick observation. I think I must have done something right. I must have got off from bed on the right side this morning, because guess what? I'm in a panel with my favorite banker. I'm on the panel with my favorite lawyer and law firm, and I'm on the panel with my favorite and most respected peer, Masdar. So I'm actually very delighted, honored, and pleased with this. Now, responding to your question, Diala, at the very outset, I have to clarify that from an operations perspective, the pandemic has had minimal impact on our portfolio. Our portfolio team and our O&M subsidiary, NOMAC, have put in place a very robust health and safety arrangements over the last 14 months. And we have operated all our plants at the availability levels that we and our stakeholders have budgeted for or were expecting, even before the pre-pandemic scenario. And this goes for both our renewables and conventional fleet. Likewise, our assets under construction, and we have quite a few of them. We have 12 assets, about $12 billion of power and water assets which are under construction right now. They have shown limited slippage, and in some cases, very few, a couple of them out of 12, where there have been a couple of months of slippage, we have got the contractual time relief protection from the off-taker. Let me now move on the growth side of the business. There is really positive sign in the sense that we have not seen in this last 14-15 months any project cancellations. Although I do need to recognize that the bid cycle and the time to financial closing has definitely lengthened. This is one of the aftermaths of the pandemic as we perceive it. In the renewable space, our project pipeline has never been so strong as we speak. We have more than a dozen transactions spanning solar PV, wind, and green hydrogen in advanced development, including some landmark transactions like the PIF program's largest solar PV called the Sudair IPP. It's a 1.5 gigawatt, which is a week away from financial close, and construction has started a couple of weeks back. From the ACWA Power point of view, in most of the jurisdictions that we operate in, the pandemic has definitely not slowed the advent of renewable projects. To the contrary, it has encouraged several jurisdictions to look even more closely at green initiatives and the energy transition to a decarbonized asset fleet. Thank you.
Yes, this aligns well with what Matthias was presenting earlier this morning, that we saw 2019 and then again in 2020 a big interest in the world and the uptake of the energy transition and more green technologies. Moving on from power projects, ACWA Power is part of a 7-team consortium that was formed to drive the cost of green hydrogen below $2 per kilogram by 2026. And we saw this is possible from what was presented earlier. Green hydrogen typically costs between $2.5 per kilogram and $9.5 today. Also, the timeline in 4 years is ahead of some of the forecasts made. So what are the factors that enable this ambitious target?
Thank you for this question, Diala. At the outset, I have to clarify that green hydrogen production is a mixture of very mature technologies, and that they have been present in several existing industrial applications. You heard Mohammed mention about it, that Masdar even started trying to look at it from a scale perspective back in 2008. That's 13 years back. And therefore, the heating value of hydrogen has been well known for decades together now. This is not new. The hype of green hydrogen being a transition fuel, being a decarbonizer, is largely linked to renewable energy costs that is coming down. And that serves as one of the most important cost inputs. And because this renewable energy cost is dramatically going down and has been brought to unprecedented levels on utility scales, and as a primary consequence, electrolysis costs also being brought down through the scale effect, all of this is now starting to become commercially viable and is rapidly going down in terms of cost. This is also helped with the evolution of battery storage, which is a parallel development taking place and which is also exponentially improving the dispatchability of solar technology. Now, ACWA Power has taken a strategic view on green hydrogen, and we have several projects at various stages of development, including the NEOM green hydrogen project in the Kingdom of Saudi, which is in a very advanced development. As a thumb rule, we see hydrogen as being in the same state as what solar energy was 5 years back. And it will for sure experience aggressive and promising cost and delivery outcomes over the coming half a decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajit. So now we're going to move into the financing side of things. So we will talk to Mr. Rajit's favorite banker, Mr. Sunil. So Mr. Sunil, in 2020, Standard Chartered announced that it would invest $75 billion to reduce the impact of its operation and that of its customers on the environment through to 2024. So $40 billion will be directed into financing services for infrastructure that promotes sustainable development, and $35 billion of project financing services, merger and acquisition advisory, and debt structuring services for renewable energy projects. So this is part of Standard Chartered's plan to become net zero across its global properties by 2030 across 60 countries. Can you tell us more about...
I can't hear you, Diala. I don't know whether it's only me or...
Okay. So I will just repeat very briefly. So can you tell us about Standard Chartered plans towards the funding the energy transition, and what does this mean for the MENA region specifically?
No, I can only see Rajit. I can't see or hear anybody. Rajit, can you hear me?
We can all hear you. Okay. I think Mr. Sunil will log off and on again. So maybe in the meantime, we can go to Bari, and then we will go back to Sunil when he's back. So Bari, we're going to look at the legal side of things. So from your experience in the region, what are the most important enabling factors that make renewable energy deployment a success story, and what are the main legal challenges?
Thank you, Diala, and thank you for your opening insights, and thank you to CEBC for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to speak alongside such an esteemed panel today. In terms of the renewable deployment and the success story of that and the challenges around that, as you mentioned, Diala, the region has, of course, some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves and the highest oil and gas production levels in the world. But notwithstanding that, we have still seen a successful deployment of renewables in the region. And a lot of that has stemmed from policy background. The majority of states have committed to quite ambitious renewable energy targets. So, for example, 60 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 in Saudi. The UAE has a target of 44% of renewable energy by 2050, with actually more ambitious targets at an emirate level. Oman and Jordan have targets of 30% by 2030, and so on across the region. So governments in the regions have policy commitments to renewable energy, and as part of that, they've committed to renewable energy programs off the back of the targets. And so we've seen, as has been discussed, a very successful large-scale renewable energy program being deployed across the region, mostly based on solar energy and procured and developed across the region. But what has driven that success, aside from the targets, as well as, I suppose, environmental pressures, in the hydrocarbon states, so primarily in the GCC, of course, there's a need to diversify the economies away from hydrocarbons and to free up hydrocarbons for other uses. So again, quite policy-centered, but there's an opportunity cost of using these hydrocarbon resources for domestic energy consumption. In the non-hydrocarbon producing states, so countries such as Jordan, there's a clear emphasis on reducing dependency on imported energy and increasing energy security. So that obviously is extremely important. And I think more than even legal policies or laws supporting the drivers to then develop projects off the back of these policy commitments, I think the projects have been supported by the success of the large-scale tenders across the region. the success has bred more success. And so we've seen increased global investment in renewables, we've seen developments in technology efficiency, increased competition, rapid competition, as well as reduced technology costs. So all of that has come together really to promote the full-scale sort of deployment of, I'd say, utility-scale renewables in the region. And projects, of course, have been upsized quite often from the original tender, including the developers on the panel today. We've often seen mega-sized projects in the region. I suppose outside of the GCC, apologies, we've seen maybe slightly smaller-sized projects, but those projects have had the support of institutional financing. So I think that's also been key when we've seen institutional financing available for the development of projects in countries such as Jordan and Egypt. In this region, generally speaking, it's correct to say that renewables was somewhat slow to take off compared to other regions of the world, but there's certainly now a steady flow of large-scale tenders in the region, and that's set to continue. As Rajat mentioned, the pipeline is vast at the moment. But there do remain challenges, and there's a lot still to be done, including from a legal perspective. So subsidy reform is still something that is ongoing in the region. Increased energy diversification is key to the region as well. And there's a lot more to facilitate the energy transition generally, not just focusing on utility-scale renewables, because I think utility-scale renewables has managed to be developed in the absence, in some cases, of even renewable-specific laws. We've seen renewable-specific laws in countries such as Jordan and Egypt and so on, facilitating the deployment of renewables. But elsewhere in the region, that hasn't been necessary. They've managed to be developed on a large scale without specific regulation. But I think to facilitate the energy transition going forward, and I know we're going to talk about it in further detail, so I don't want to go into detail now, but I think further regulation is going to be required to facilitate the energy transition generally as we move away just from looking at utility-scale renewables.
Thank you, Vari. And we have Mr. Sunil back with us. I hope this time it will work. So yes, it's working perfectly. Welcome back, Mr. Sunil.
I got your question.
Wonderful.
In terms of the commitment we made of the 75 billion. Well, let me first of all thank you for having me here, and sorry for the interruption. I really don't know what happened. But just to give a little bit of perspective on the commitment that we've made, I think there are a couple of aspects to it. This is on the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. We have said by 2030 we'll be net zero. But on scope 3, which is the financing which results in emissions, we said it's going to be 2050. And one of the pillars to net zero by 2050 for scope 3 is how do we facilitate, is one of the pillars, it's not the only one, is how do we facilitate and in many ways accelerate the transition. So the $75 billion is committed towards that. And I think there are a couple of aspects to it. Customers who are ready, like Rajat, like Masdar, who are ready, and share the ambition already, have a framework for implementation. The $75 billion is available for deployment. So that is for customers who are sharing the same ambition and mindset. But I think a large part of the customer base is either just about starting or has not yet started. And this financing is not something which would be available to them because they would not qualify for it. So what we are doing for those customers is actually helping them and hand-holding them to really create the roadmap. In the case they are just about to start, create the roadmap for them to be able to meet this net zero ambition and commitment. And the ones who have not started as yet, and do remember that there's a lot of fear, uncertainty in corporates as you start going down the ladder. When you're sitting right on top, it is quite different. But if you're looking at slightly smaller corporates, there is a lot of fear and a lack of certainty in terms of how do you implement this. And there we are helping them to really identify the most credible levers that they can pull and help them to really come up to a point where they can set a framework, because what's going to happen, and I don't know how, and we don't think it is very, very clear to a lot of the corporates, particularly in MENA. And when I say MENA, as you rightly said, Diana, that it is a very different multi-track, multi-dimensional, multi-speed approach. So UAE, Saudi at the forefront, and a couple of other GCC countries, but there are a lot of others who are lagging. So I think what is going to really happen, and what we are seeing really coming quite quickly, is a kind of a pincer type movement where availability of capital is going to become a challenge. If you're not having a credible plan, most banks will not be able to finance you, irrespective of your sector. I'm talking about if you're carbon emitting. Then on the supply chain, there's a big pressure coming through. MNCs are looking at their supply chains and saying, you know what, if you're not having a clear plan, you're not going to be part of our ecosystem. And lastly, let's not forget what regulation is doing. So if you look at Europe, what they've done, and they're at the forefront of it, the carbon adjustment border mechanism, or carbon border adjustment mechanism. Clearly, they're going to put a tax on imports from countries and companies which are not going to be net zero or don't have a plan in place, or not certified to have a credible plan. And that's where, again, we create the framework to help our corporates. So I think this is a wake-up call and a call to action for a lot of the corporates in the region, that this is coming, and it's coming very fast. It may not yet be, because the banks, the financiers, and this reminds me, 8-10 years ago when I don't know how the example, I hope the example is relevant, when all the AML regulations were coming in, your international banks led with it, and there was a lot of pain and angst that, oh my God, you guys are making things so difficult for us. But today it's become a norm, because you know what happened when FATF came in and AML regulations have come into local regulations, so on and so forth. So I think we're moving that direction. While the regulation is coming from the West, I think the compliance will be required across the board. So it's a call to action for all the corporates who want to be part of a broader ecosystem.
Thank you, Mr. Sunil. And do you think the region is ready for the ESG financing?
I think parts of it are ready. As I said, if you look at the leading corporates, you mentioned Etihad, they've already done a financing which we were part of, linked to ESG goals. You've got Majid Al Futtaim Group, you've got ACWA, you've got Masdar who are there. But there is a whole slew of these are the top-notch blue chip companies. But there are a whole slew of corporates who are not ready, and countries who are not ready. So we've done Zeronomics, what we call a report which we did to understand the preparedness of companies, and 3 in 5 believe that they are not yet ready. These are companies themselves talking about it. 3 in 5 say that we are not yet ready. A similar percentage say that they're likely to delay their plans because of COVID, and because their focus has shifted into doing other stuff, which is probably immediate and existential. Do remember, what we're trying to do is a multi-year, future, forward-looking initiative, and there are quite a few challenges which are immediate. So I think there's been a diversion in terms of invest in technology to create access, invest in maybe creating more efficiencies in your projects right now, or your company right now. So it is not top of the mind. And we really don't have an ecosystem of regulation, of rules in place, which are forcing companies to either go in for disclosure or to come up with a plan. But it is coming, and it is coming fast, particularly for companies that access financing from international markets, international agencies, or international banks to start with. But I think it is very soon going to go into the banking system. And you know how it will go into the local banking system? Because somebody may say, my local bank actually is never going to do this. It is going to go into the local banking system because local banks also access the international markets. So when they are accessing the international markets, their portfolios come under scrutiny. It's already happening the best to say, okay, what is your portfolio? What's your exposure? What's your climate risk on your portfolio? What is your sustainability strategy? And if those banks are unable to demonstrate credibly that they have a plan, the cost of capital and the cost of funding goes up. And you know what they're going to do? They are going to come up with a plan, which means they'll do exactly what we're doing, perhaps maybe a couple of years later. So it is an interconnected world, and I don't think there is any escaping from it.
Exactly. It is very remarkable how it picks up very fast due to us being all connected. So it's not only the virus that spreads very fast, it's also good practices that spread, and it's very nice to see that. So Mr. Sunil, you mentioned that so many companies and countries are not ready for ESG. Sorry, we did not spell out ESG for, I hate to use acronyms without saying what they are, environment, social, and governance criteria when it comes to financing. So a lot of countries are not ready for it. So this brings us to our second part of our discussion. So we go back to Muhammad, going back to Masdar. Going into the context of countries that are, we mentioned in the MENA, are still a bit lagging behind the main players of the clean energy in the region. So Mohammed, can you tell us about Masdar projects in less developed markets? For example, we know Masdar is very prominent in Jordan. And what enabling factors led you to go there? First, how did Masdar go to Jordan? And what would be required from other countries to attract you to their market? So what would it take to take Masdar to come to my country, Lebanon, for example, a country that is blooming in so many crises, where we are in desperate need of an energy transition?
Well, thank you, Dalia, for this question. I think Masdar, like any other business, we aim to create value to our shareholder, especially if the shareholder is Mubadala Investment Company, which is the Abu Dhabi main investment vehicle and also one of the largest investment portfolios in the world. But at the same time, we are helping to diversify the UAE's economy and bringing new geographies and sectors into our portfolio. We, as a strategy, always seek long-term bankable projects with clearly defined risk boundaries, calculated risk, call it if you will, as well as strong partnership in each and every country we operate. We rely on our expertise, on our knowledge, know-how, local presence, and also our ability to scale and to make the right connections and find the right opportunities wherever we operate, underline right opportunities. Masdar always looks for growth through platform and joint ventures, enabling us to work with local partners. We like to reinforce the local content and bring value to any region or place we operate in. We always seek commonality in partners, and we bring strong elements to any partnership, such as strong technical EPC financing, structuring skills, for example. So let us go back to the regions. We were amongst the very first who started in Jordan. In Jordan, currently we have Baynuna, which is a 200 megawatt photovoltaic project that will power approximately 160,000 homes and displace around 360,000 tons of CO2. In addition, we have also Tawila JWPC, 117 megawatt wind. We started early on in Egypt. We have 10 megawatt photovoltaic in a place called Siwa. And we started also many of the projects in Egypt that account up to 30% of the grid capacity in these western borderline with Libya communities. We've established Infinity Power in Egypt, which is a joint venture with Infinity Energy, the Egypt's leading renewable energy developer, to develop utility scale and distributed solar energy and wind power projects in Egypt and take it as a launch pad to go to Africa. In Africa, we believe there are great opportunities. We have two projects in Seychelles, for example. We have 7 megawatt wind and 5 megawatt PV. We believe even in, let's call them less privileged countries, there are great opportunities. If these countries at least commit to the right governance, as Vary mentioned, the right regulatory frameworks, and work diligently to work in a consistent pattern by providing the required guarantees on sovereign funds, by approaching the right financial institutions, for example, the African Development Bank, with the right message that promotes sustainability, that promotes the global initiatives into carbon neutrality. And with that consistent approach, we can still make it happen. Of course, there are other technical parameters, and this is where I put my engineering hat. And for a project to work, for example, in Lebanon, our most prominent challenge is not regulations and governance, because I know that Lebanese are far advanced, even other Arab nations, in the way they interacted with the Western culture, civilization, in the way they adopted regulatory frameworks, in the way they have the forward thinking to adopt and approach even much faster and in an accelerated manner any new governance that you can put on the table, because Lebanon is full of talent. Nonetheless, from a technical point of view, to develop mega-scale renewable energy projects, we need infrastructure. We need to be able to penetrate and export such capacity. And in countries like Lebanon, that would be the most prominent challenge, because of whatever is happening on the ground, whatever the government is doing to promote all these development projects on the ground. It's not doing enough, unfortunately. And I hope that in the near future, we have a more sound, well-structured government that will give more stability, more comfort to developers like us, like ACWA Power, to go and invest there, and also continue and commence a consistent development of their infrastructure to enable such renewable energy projects to be adopted and developed.
Thank you, Mohammed. We share your hopes as well. Thank you. All right, so moving to another country that has managed to attract investments. And Mohammed, you mentioned the importance of development banks and development funding institutions. So we can go to Morocco now with Rajid. So ACWA Power has developed projects in Morocco, one of the first CSP projects in the world, and a large part of it was due to the development financing opportunities there. But of course, there's a lot more. And Mohammed mentioned the importance of infrastructure. I think infrastructure was made available for this project. So can you tell us more about your experience in Morocco and what has led to the success of your projects?
Thank you, Diala. Thank you for the opportunity to showcase a little bit about our experience in Morocco. We started in 2012, so that's almost 8 years back, which is a long time when you see how the global landscape for renewables has evolved. Our experience, our whole experience trajectory in Morocco have been very critical for our evolution as a leading player in the renewables globally. We are today the largest, owning and operating the largest fleet of concentrated solar plants. We have total 11 gigawatts of renewables under construction, advanced development, or in operation. And we hold the world record for some of the lowest tariffs under the public-private partnership model for many of these renewable projects. Especially very proud of the last solar utility scale project, which is the Al Faisalia, or now renamed as the Shoiba 600 megawatt project, with a tariff of 1.04 cents levelized tariff. Almost broke the sound barrier there. Anyway, the lessons learned across the renewable technologies, be it CSP with thermal storage or operating utility scale large solar PVs and wind farms, have provided us with a lot of valuable insights in relation to project execution, operations, and how you basically manage the commercial and the technical aspects of these large, complex projects through their life cycle. We have already replicated, and actually beyond replication, I would say we have significantly improved at scale our Moroccan success story in a number of other geographies and jurisdictions. And a case in point for me would be what has been achieved a couple of years back for the Noor Energy 1 CSP come PV project in here locally in Dubai under the umbrella of DIVA, where we have been able to demonstrate the commercial viability and bankability of round-the-clock dispatchability using renewable solar power vis-a-vis conventional alternatives. Please let me remind everyone that the Noor Energy 1 project, which is a $4.3 billion single-site renewable project in advanced construction right now here in Sheikh Maktoum Park in Dubai, is actually the first project in the world which will deliver 24/7, 365 days a year electricity to the grid as a renewable project. It's a complement of CSP, storage, and PV that enables it to reach this unique distinction. Our experiences also in developing wind farms, especially in Morocco, has been very rich, and we have a 120 megawatt wind farm called the Khaladi wind farm in Morocco. It has also enabled us to understand the operations of large-scale wind farms. It may be noted that the Khaladi wind farm in Morocco that I'm talking about, on top of being a large-scale utility wind asset in our portfolio, it also represents one of our early exposure to corporate PPA schemes. 5 years back, actually 6 years back, or 5.5 years back, when there was not so much traction on the corporate PPAs, at least in the emerging markets, Khaladi wind farm, 120 megawatt, was one of the first unique utility scale project which put in place a bankable corporate PPA scheme. And it was not short-term PPAs, it was long-term PPAs of 20 years, where we had 3 large PPAs consuming more than 80% of the wind generation spread across the cement industry. And the schemes that the scheme that we put in place are now gaining more and more momentum, especially in the regions of Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where we are now very busy structuring a diverse power offtake structure to accommodate the customer's need, a lot of it based on these corporate PPA schemes. So that, in essence, both from a technology perspective, from a commercial perspective, and from a structure perspective, was the interesting experiences that we developed in the last half a decade in Morocco, which we are successfully replicating in the other footprints where we operate or we intend to operate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting and very, very hopeful to hear. And it's very interesting when we see the mix of technologies coming together to deliver one solution for various objectives. Thank you very much. So going back to Vari, so we heard about the requirements in the countries where we are looking into more of a challenging transition. Can you give us more insights about the legal situation and what is required in terms of legal framework, if we can go and dive into this context a bit more?
Okay, so I mean, in terms of looking at the broader energy transition, which is what I suppose where I left last time, and as opposed to just utility scale renewables, which obviously, you know, is extremely important, but there's much more to the energy transition than just looking at utility scale renewables. I think, first of all, just a couple of points that are not strictly speaking legal. The first one is that the current momentum that we've seen in terms of renewables deployment, that needs to be maintained if the full potential of renewables and the energy transition is to be realized in the region and the countries are to achieve their renewable energy targets. So we really need that momentum to continue, and it looks like it's going to, but obviously you know, there's still a long way to go. The second one is that, and Sunil has touched on this already as well, that developers of renewable energy projects and the energy transition as a whole will benefit from a renewed emphasis on sustainability by lenders. So the sort of ESG focus, it was coming already, but I think it's been exemplified by the COVID pandemic. We do, however, still see that there's a challenge of funding conventional fuel-based projects, that should, I think, be advantageous to the energy transition. That challenge was already apparent before, and the increased pressure on banks to pursue sustainable and environmentally friendly practices, I think, will benefit the energy transition. Having said that, though, I think there's also a difference, and this is a challenge sort of both from a financing but also a structuring perspective in terms of energy transition or renewable energy projects that benefit from fixed or guaranteed tariffs versus those which are more subject to merchant risk, and they're less likely to attract a pool of lenders, or they'll attract a smaller pool of lenders. I think that's an ongoing challenge, and one of the key requirements to try and get around that is that we need to make sure that there is actually tailored regulation, and that's really where, you know, I'd like to move on to some of the sort of topics that we need to address from a legal perspective. Looking at, firstly, distributed energy. If we look at the C&I market, the regulatory regime for the C&I market is less developed. And again, there's an emerging difference in approaches between hydrocarbon and non-hydrocarbon producing countries. The GCC countries generally limit the ability of the C&I market to enter into corporate or private PPAs. And that approach is, they take generally as of one of net metering, where the excess power is transferred to what's normally a monopoly off-taker to offset future utility bills. Now, the restrictions I think that net metering has, it really limits the ability of the C&I market and rooftop solar market to reach its full potential. Outside of the GCC, other countries have taken different approaches. So in Jordan, for example, Jordan also has a wheeling regime in place, and that facilitates corporate or private PPAs. So from a legal perspective, more can be done from a legal and regulatory perspective to facilitate the growth of the C&I market. Moving on to storage, the emphasis on utility scale PV in the region, of course, presents clear technical challenges to grid operators in terms of intermittent supply, and also making sure that the grid is properly balanced. So storage is really quite key. We've seen this massive emphasis on utility scale PV. The ability of storage to step in, and Rajat's already mentioned that the plant in Dubai, the CSP plant, has the ability to have 24/7 output, and that's of course because it has the ability to have storage attached to it, with the molten salt storage that attaches to CSP. But we have a massive amount of PV sitting in the region already, or currently under construction or being tendered, and so alternative types of storage are being explored. And I think having in place tailored regulation to help promote the development and deployment of storage is going to be important. And it's also, you know, the development, it's not just deployment, it is the development as well, because the emphasis on storage, I think, there's a lot of talk about it, but clearly there are a lot of things that still have to be properly assessed from both a technical and from a scalability perspective. And we need the regulation as well, I think, to walk hand in hand with that development. Hydrogen, we've heard a lot about hydrogen already, so I don't want to go into too much detail. There's obviously a lot of projects in the pipeline, including from both ACWA and Masdar, as they've mentioned already. The opportunities are vast, and obviously the opportunities for what it can be used for are vast in terms of grid stabilization, transportation, industrial uses, gas networks, and so on. But the regulatory regime isn't there yet. The regulatory regime is a bit lagging in terms of hydrogen in the region. And I think if it's going to reach its full potential, again, that's an area where we need to see more tailored regulation, particularly, you know, to facilitate the deployment of green hydrogen projects. Because I think, you know, as has been discussed, they're set to become a key part of the energy transition. And the last part, just briefly, is on digitalization and blockchain. And it's a little bit related to the distributed energy C&I point that I mentioned. But I think the development of decentralized electricity markets, management and trading, and potential use of independent microgrids, that presents policy and regulatory challenges, because some of the challenges that I mentioned in relation to the C&I market also limit or prevent the development of, for example, microgrids. So in order to realise that full potential, we're going to need to see either new or changed regulation that will facilitate really the full potential of digitalisation, blockchain, and potentially microgrids in the region being developed. At the moment, a lot of this just aren't simply possible based on the current regulatory regimes. So that's sort of each of those topics. I could probably talk half an hour to an hour or two rather than just a few seconds, but happy, of course, to take questions on any of them, but hopefully that's a bit of a taster as to where I think there's quite a lot of regulation needed.
Thank you, Vari. This is indeed a very interesting topic, and yeah, I wish we had more hours to discuss. So far, we have 10 more minutes, and I would like to use them very efficiently. So Sunil, back to you before we take questions from the floor. Vari discussed the importance of regulatory framework, a stable regulatory framework, and its role in attracting financing. So at the same time, we have seen that the global discourse on climate change has been focused in some countries. Is it prominent in? How can we make it prominent in the rest of the world? How can we make financing for renewable energy feasible in the rest of the world?
No, that's a great point, and I'm conscious of time. I'll keep my response brief. I think it has to start with, first of all, in the countries that are lagging, you cannot leave them behind. It cannot be a world where you leave large swaths of emerging economies behind. So there will have to be engagement. Clearly, the West is leading because the West has the bulk share in terms of the emissions. There has been movement around civil society movement, NGO movement, shareholder activism, which has forced them to really accelerate their plans and create the taxonomies, create the regulation, and even political change. So we need to pick up the best practices and really create the awareness and the policies in some of these markets. It's absolutely essential. Now, again, as we said, there are divergences. So we're talking about markets which are lagging, and one of the big catalysts can be access to finance, not from the point of view of denying finance, but saying that you get this access to finance, provided you start shaping policy around a net zero, and that starts with the budgetary, kind of decisions that are made within the budget. How do you finance the deficit? And most have an international component to it. I think that requires a lot of engagement to take place. The other one, which is very, very important to get, and then we see a wall of capital waiting to come in. And as you rightly said at the outset, that the share in Middle East and Africa you mentioned is minuscule. The reason is because there's a lot of concern around transparency, metrics, and greenwashing. So again, you come back to how do you create the framework? How do you monitor? How do you test and ensure that it is going into the right projects and is generating the right outcomes? So I think it's all about, you're going to have a multi-speed approach to it. There's nothing wrong with it. Some sector, we are going to increase overall emissions in some emerging markets. That's a fact of life. But you're going to have countermeasures so that the net emissions come off. And that also means, we didn't touch upon it, we don't have the time, is how do you create carbon trading markets? That's very, very important, because you've got in this region, if you take the example, and we just about launched in Singapore with SGX and with Temasek a carbon exchange. So you create the opportunity for institutions in the transition period to purchase those credits, and the money goes into projects which create the offset. Some natural, some which are more investment led. So there is a whole swath of things that need to be done. But I think, being a banker, I'll have a biased view, but finance can be a catalyst for it.
It's the most important catalyst, maybe one or among the most important ones. Okay, so from here we will move into the socioeconomic benefits of renewable energy, or the energy transition. We can no longer speak about renewable energy alone. We have to speak of it as a transition, because as jobs are created and as industries are created, some are sometimes lost along the way. And we want to make sure that nobody is left behind. So not in terms of starting point of countries, and this is something you mentioned, Sunil, and this is very important for us at IRENA, to always iterate that not all countries start from the same starting point, and we are not expecting all countries to be net zero by 2050. Net zero is on a global level, and different countries have different paces of transition. But also, one important dimension of this transition is to make it just and fair, and to make sure that whatever we are losing along the way, we are creating jobs, industries, and it's not just only jobs, it's also the quality of the jobs that are created with renewable energy. Maybe they're a bit more safe than other industries, maybe they are even more involved in innovation and technology. So from here, I will go back to Rajit. So we will talk about a bit of local content. And we have a question from Dr. Raed, who is also, we've been discussing with Dr. Raed the opportunities for local value creation in the MENA region for a long time, because we see an immense opportunity for job creation and value creation. So Dr. Raed's question is about local content plans for Sudair solar project with financing from with the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you for the question, Dr. Raed. It's a good, interesting question. And of course, no discussion on the energy transition, as you said, Diala, is complete without talking about the socio-economic benefit. Look, let me give a few facts out there, which will probably help to respond to Dr. Raed. First and foremost, the PIF, well, what is the total space of renewable that the Kingdom of Saudi is stated to put out there? It's about 60 gigawatts that they are powering up in the next decade, just in terms of numbers and stats. The way they have now decided, and this is all public information that I'm putting out there, is that 70% of it will be implemented by PIF, and 30% of it will be implemented by the Ministry of Energy under the REPTO, the so-called REPTO program, through the international tendering competitive procurement route. And ACWA Power, on one hand, will be competing with the Masdars of the world, EDF Renewables, and NL Greens, and so on and so forth of the world on the 30%. But ACWA Power also has been chosen by PIF in the short to medium term as its technical implementation partner for the 70% of this overall procurement. Now, the 70% procurement under PIF is something that is heavily regulated, for those of you who don't know, by ECRA. The regulator, who has been given now enormous amount of teeth, has now started to demonstrate itself as one of the, I would say, very strong regulator, energy regulator, has been well-staffed, is now bringing in the best practices of the world, and so on and so forth. Now, the regulator will make sure that the procurement implementation of the PIF program is going to mirror and follow what is going to happen in parallel on the 30% international that the Ministry of Energy through REPTO will be following, which means the tariff will be benchmarked to what progressively will get set through this tendering route, and the rules of the procurement for the 70% PIF program will be no different from what that will be applicable for this 30% implementation. And there I bring the link back to what Dr. Raed was asking, which is the localization requirement on Sudair IPP, which is the first flagship 1500 megawatt, the largest in the kingdom, but under the PIF implementation program, is mirroring exactly the requirements that were put in place for the REPTO 2 procurement program, which is just gone into construction for some of the winners like Masdar, and so on and so forth. So if the requirement there was 32% for this round of procurement, the requirement for Sudair is going to be 32%. I'm just giving an example. But the REPTO program in itself is devised to step up the game and keep improving through successive and progressive implementation of REPTO 3, REPTO 4, REPTO 5, and so on and so forth. The level of the socio-economic impact and localization is expected to step up to significant numbers in a meaningful manner, including the component of manufacturing, not just the employment, but also the component of manufacturing. And therefore, this is how they are keeping the entire ecosystem of the 60 gigawatts that will be implemented fair and true to reflect the best benchmarks of competitive procurement. Thank you.
Thank you. As very interesting. I see why Dr. Raed wanted to speak about this. Very interesting. So our time is almost over, but we asked for 5 more minutes. I will go back to every panelist to summarize main takeaways. I think we can do half a minute each, because before that, I would like to go back to Muhammad. In the discussion on, but maybe in the meantime, panelists can think of a half a minute takeaway. Mohammed, in the meantime, can we touch upon water? I mean, the MENA region is a region that is highly stressed in water. It's part of the socioeconomic, maybe let's say nexus between energy and water in the region that is very important that we cannot disregard. So let's give some time to water before we move on to the main takeaways. What are the plans for desalination, and what is the future outlook for desalination in the region?
Well, you are touching upon the topic that is near and dear to my heart. You know, we always say that water sits as a center stage of sustainable development. Thus, we have the water energy nexus and water energy food, and water for energy and energy for water. I think in Masdar back in 2015, we decided that it's time for us to play such a prominent role in taking the new generation of water production to the new phase. We've launched the Renewable program, which was an innovative program partnering with, we started with 4, then 5, then 6 of the largest in the industry, including Veolia, Suez, Mascara on localized solutions. At that time, Abingawa Water, which was really huge in the industry before the financial crisis, in addition to Trevi Systems, who were promoting the forward osmosis as an innovative solution. We focused on membrane desalination because we believe this is the future, and because of the diversification of our energy portfolios worldwide, we need to decouple that, not so much happily ever after marriage between thermal, power generation using steam turbines and thermal desalination. We've launched this program, and 3 out of the 5 have succeeded in meeting both the qualitative and quantitative. And now, these parameters, you can hear it resonate, the Renewable program outcome, as setting the seam of this new generation of membrane technology that aims to, A, drastically reduce the energy intensity, because we know that desalination is an energy intensive process. We used to talk about 4 and 4.2 kilowatt hour per meter cubic. Now we are pushing the boundaries up to 3. And I'm talking that in relevance to the Gulf water, which has very high salinity. And also coupling the desalination with renewable energy, thus the concept of sustainable water desalination. You will be hearing that concept coming more and more, and the international community at large needs to push boundaries into regulating this concept. So with new tenders and the new bids, we were all talking about, you know, the sustainability pillars. We are all talking about carbon neutrality. The carbon footprint of water desalination is huge. But with this, we reduce that carbon footprint to the lowest possible. We couple the desalination with an environmentally friendly R&D, most prominently ZLD, the zero liquid discharge. And you know what? All this bundle still needs to be cost competitive. So now we start at, if I recall back in 2012-13, $2.8 per metric cubic. Now we are at 40 cents per metric cubic, and it's even further decreasing. So we believe that we are now on the verge of the next phase of a large utility scale commercialization of such technology that is sustainable, that has the lowest carbon footprint, that uses the latest of energy efficient membrane desalination, and that is mostly cost effective.
This is very hopeful and very interesting. I wish we had more time. So unfortunately, we need to wrap up this session. So Mohammed, by the time you think of your 30-second takeaway, we'll start with the ladies first. So Vari, can you give us a 30-second takeaway of the session? What would you like to say?
Thank you, and thanks very much for the opportunity. In terms of renewable projects, there really is positivity in the market. So we've seen a slowdown in procurements as a result of the pandemic, but the sector did not escape the wrath of the pandemic, but the pipeline is strong. So that's really positive. But we do also need to clearly focus on the broader energy transition, a just transition and decarbonisation. So we need to maintain the momentum of renewable energy projects, but we need to facilitate the development and deployment of key technology. We need to facilitate strong ESG policies. We need to facilitate C&I and distributed renewables, commercial industrial. We need to facilitate microgrids and really take a hold of technology, the opportunities that blockchain will provide. And of course, green hydrogen, and we didn't get into the discussion today, but things such as district cooling, and in some countries, of course, district heating, those have, a massive impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So those also need to be a core part of the energy transition. But I think it's a positive discussion. There's a long way to go, of course, and it's a journey that I think everyone is on. And hopefully we'll all continue on that. And maybe this time next year, we'll have a bit more to talk about and see how far along that journey we've reached.
For sure. Thank you, Vari. So, Sunil?
Well, I would just say that, ESG is mainstream now. In terms of our own survey and assessment we have done, the region is slow to start off and take off. Again, with the caveat that there are different countries and different, speeds, multi-speed kind of an approach. If you look at the plans of most of the companies, they are talking about most of the action between 2030 and 40. So there's a lost decade between 2020 and 2030. So I would really urge everyone to really make, coherent plans in terms of compliance, because we are in a region which is resource based. It's going to be of acute focus in terms of capital allocation, in terms of the overall carbon footprint that is generated out of this region. So I don't think there's any escaping the fact, and we are part of a connected ecosystem. So the pressure will be felt by one and all. So I think it's time to get plans together and start executing. And we are there to help in whichever way we can our clients.
Thank you. And Rajit?
Yeah, hi. I think my 30-second statement would be essentially the fact that, look, energy transition is the most defining event for this decade, or one of the most defining event of this decade, without a shadow of doubt. And I think in the context of that, the single most important trigger for us looking forward, not looking behind, but looking forward, is the how soon and how well we adapt and trigger the hydrogen economy.
Thank you very much. Indeed. Mohammed, we close with you.
Okay, one of my favorite writers, may her soul rest in peace, is Dr. Maya Angelou. She said, one of my favorite quotes is, "You need to stop being normal to find how amazing you are." I think we need to think outside the box. We need to push boundaries in the way we think and approach renewable energy at all aspects: governance, regulations, financing. We need to realize as an international community that renewable clean energy and sustainability is not only it's our means to survive, it's our means to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the best closing we could have hoped for. Thank you, Mohammed. So thank you for the organizers of this session. A big thank you for the panelists. It is true that the biggest event of this decade is the energy transition, and I am very honored to be part of it, and especially with you. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your very interesting insights, and thank you very much for the organizers of this panel. Thank you very much, and wishing you a good rest of the day and a very interesting discussion ahead in the rest of the workshop. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you all. All the best.
Bye.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this exciting panel, and thank you, Diala, for the excellent moderation. The has already been activated since few minutes. Some of you have already been using it. We are running a bit behind the agenda, so we'll try to go back to the original agenda. So please make sure that you join the first presentation, which will start in 2 minutes. Then the time for the networking at the end of the event, so you could use that after the second panel and network. And again, just for those who just joined, on the left side, you see the networking section. If you click on that, you could network with the speakers, the attendees of the event. So please make sure to try that and connect with people who are attending the event. So we'll start the next presentation in exactly 2 minutes. So please make sure that you are still at that stage.
It is a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to say thank you first of all to the Clean Energy Business Council for the opportunity to speak, and congratulations on hosting such a timely and important summit. My name is Daniel Hanna. I'm the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Standard Chartered, and I have the privilege of speaking to you today about the challenge of the transition. As we actually just heard from the last panel, the energy transition is indeed the next industrial revolution. As the global economy shifts carbon and fossil fuels-based system of energy production, distribution and consumption to a more sustainable source of energy as the world moves and indeed accelerates towards net. Renewable energy such as wind and solar and electric vehicles typically come to mind when one thinks about this energy transition. It actually encompasses a much wider ecosystem of change. Actually, in some ways, the switch to electrification and powering by renewables is the easy bit. How we tackle the hard-to-abate sectors is really the challenge for the coming decade. For example, steel and cement production account for 7 to 9% of global greenhouse emissions. While we know the pathway for many sectors like steel, electric arc furnaces, hydrogen, recycling, these solutions are not yet scaled and commercial. And indeed, in any other sectors, the technology, frankly, is just not available. It will be some time before we run a fully electric long haul. As we accelerate towards net zero, the Middle East can and indeed must play a pivotal role. This is why this summit is so timely. The urgency for action, I think, was absolutely underlined by the recent IEA report that I know we've talked about in the summit already. If you go beyond the attention-grabbing headline of no new oil and gas developments, the report makes quite a sobering read for the region. If the world is moving to net zero, oil demand peaked in 2019, and gas will peak in 2030. Between 2020 and 2050, demand for oil falls by 75%, and natural gas by 55%. As a result, net income in oil-dependent economies dropped to historic lows. Even in locations like the GCC, which will produce the last barrel of oil, given its low cost and low carbon, growth in market share is overwhelmed by price falls. As the IEA somewhat dryly notes, structural reforms will be needed to address societal challenges. Are we on track for this net zero scenario? No. To achieve even the more modest Paris Agreement, net carbon emissions must fall by 45% from 2010 levels in the next 9 years. We need urgent action in this decade to get onto that pathway. But let me be clear, failing to reach Paris or net zero leads to real economic and social cost in the Middle East as well. Just taking the global cost of rising sea levels alone, not factoring in the wider weather changes, is estimated to cost the world economy $14 trillion a year by 2100. And a percentage of GDP, the impact is actually highest of all countries globally in Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE. So we're not on track, but are we likely to accelerate towards net zero? Yes. 2/3 of global GDP is now covered by some form of net zero ambition, and just over 20% of the world's largest companies have a net zero target. Pressure continues to build from consumers. More than 3/4 across all regions, including the Middle East, consistently say that climate is a top issue and one that they want to see companies take action. Regulators are increasingly active. In fact, the number of ESG regulations has increased 5-fold in the last 10 years. TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Related Disclosures, is now compulsory on many exchanges, and central banks are asking insurers and banks to stress test their portfolios for climate risk. Carbon tariffs are being openly discussed by the US and the European Union. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. Investors responsible for $5.7 trillion and $37 trillion of assets have signed up to the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, respectively. The impact from these pressures is not decades away, it's actually already being felt. Global spending on renewables, electric vehicles, and other low-carbon energy technologies reached a record-breaking high last year of $501 billion. In a forthcoming study that Standard Chartered is about to publish, we find that 1/3 of multinationals are already taking a zero-tolerance approach to their supply chain. 15% have already started dropping suppliers that will put in jeopardy their transition and net zero targets. And 78% of multinationals say they will put these steps in place by 2025. This presents significant risks for the Middle East, but also opportunities. In a net zero scenario, investment in energy actually rises from $2 trillion globally on average over the last 5 years to almost $5 trillion per annum by 2030, according to the IEA. But the composition radically changes. Electric generation grows to 1.6 trillion by 2030. Annual investment in hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels and bioenergy grows to almost 140 billion by 2050. Standard Chartered expects that the cumulative global capex on wind and solar will reach $1.5 trillion each by 2030, and technologies like CCS will commercialize with $340 billion of spending. Given its open economies, geographic location, abundant sunshine, and land, the GCC in the Middle East has huge potential to exploit the energy transition across renewables, developing blue and green hydrogen. Facilities like ADNOC's new plant, Ruwais, will not be one-offs for very long. In a region where job creation remains a priority, IRENA's estimates that renewables could add 42 million jobs through to 2050 is obviously worth keeping in mind. However, the world, and especially the Middle East, is not grasping the opportunity from the energy transition. Our recent Zeronomics report asked senior executives at 250 companies and 100 investors and found 3 key barriers to net zero: a lack of urgency, a need for clear standards, and a lack of finance. Only 40% of executives believe that their companies support the Paris Agreement, and 71% of companies are postponing any action until after the 2030s. In the Middle East, support for Paris is actually the lowest of any region, with just 35% of companies responding positively. We need to collectively shift this perception. A lack of standards is an issue. In this region, 80% said a lack of consensus on net zero definitions was a major barrier. And indeed, 90% said in setting a standard that was globally accepted, that would be a major acceleration. And this is a real challenge. Net zero is often used interchangeably with zero carbon, carbon neutral, or carbon negative. Yet they imply very different decarbonisation pathways and different coverage of greenhouse gases. And to finance. Finance is obviously a key issue. It's cited by 80% of executives in the Middle East, much higher than the global average of 67. Carbon-intensive companies face indeed the biggest challenge in this space, with 71% of senior executives and 81% of investors seeing a capital shortfall in this topic. We need more regional companies and institutions to follow the likes of Etihad and Majid Al Futtaim in setting meaningful targets and, more importantly, roadmaps on how to develop them and move towards net zero. But how do we tackle this financing gap? Well, in the absence of a global carbon price, let me suggest 3 key levers that can help: partnerships, innovation in capital, and innovation in markets. This is very much a global challenge with no single silver bullet, and it will require collaboration across the financial sector, industries, regulators, and governments. Governments should take the lead in setting ambitious net zero targets. Regulators should also consider how they can facilitate an energy transition. At Standard Chartered, we are committed to playing our part in this. We have committed to being net zero in our own operations by 2030 and to bring the impact of our financing aligned with net zero by 2050. We've committed $75 billion in sustainable infrastructure and renewables focused on developing and emerging markets, and we've already provided $20 billion to that in our first year. We're also building expertise and transition levers across electrification, hydrocarbon, and CCS. We see opportunities to facilitate collaboration across the entire value chain, using data, analytics, work to identify opportunities. And indeed, we're working with our clients to help them develop their own pathways and sustainable finance frameworks. Earlier this month, we published our first 2 transition pathways for oil and gas and metals and mining on how we can help and indeed what those industries can do to move to net zero. But more capital is definitely needed, but also different types of capital. Transition and blended finance will be important tools. Transition finance in its own must be developed as an asset class. This will require standards, and we're developing our own framework for transition finance and have asked regulators such as the European Commission and others to develop theirs. We were very pleased to partner with Etihad in launching the world's first transition bond for an airline company anywhere, and are working with several other examples in other industries. Etihad's Sukuk format indeed shows the natural synergy between Islamic and sustainable finance. The use of blended finance, which is the strategic use of development or government capital to commercial capital, will play a pivotal role here. $47 billion of blended finance has already been targeted at renewables in the emerging markets. And Standard Chartered has been involved in more than $5 billion of those. And we see there's significant opportunity to scale that to accelerate the adoption of new technologies. New markets must also be created. We need to facilitate new flows of capital into both new transition technology and nature-based solutions such as forest carbon sinks. We see an opportunity for voluntary carbon markets to play a key role here. Offsets are not a substitute for reducing emissions, but credible avoidance and reduction carbon credits can complement and accelerate companies' zero. This is why we were pleased to work with Mark Carney on the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, and also to create Climate Impact X, a voluntary carbon credit exchange which was announced last week, and a marketplace for nature-based solutions. The Middle East is making progress in this space. In the UAE, as we heard just in the last panel, efforts across ADNOC, Masdar, Mubadala into investments in renewables, wind, blue ammonia, blue and green hydrogen and energy storage are carving a way for local and international investors to follow. The UAE is location of 3 of the largest and lowest cost solar projects in the world and has significant investments in more than 30 projects globally. India has made similar announcements in renewables and in sectors like hydrogen, and alongside Qatar and the US, Canada and Norway, the creation recently of the Net Zero Producer Initiative. As we will hear on the next panel, regional companies like Majid Al Futtaim and governments like Egypt are tapping sustainable finance markets to fund investment. And we're working on a robust pipeline of future transition and sustainable bonds as more and more companies and governments turn to this format. The energy transition presents particular challenges and opportunities for the Middle East. But this region is no stranger to reinvention. Almost 100 years ago, Gulf economies slumped as the dominant pearl fishing industry was hit by the worldwide depression and Japan perfecting the technology of creating synthetic pearls. In the midst of this economic turmoil, 1929 was the year that the first oil well was discovered and operated in Bahrain. And that ushered in a new century of oil-backed growth for the region. We may well be on the brink of a similar tipping point in the region. Thank you.
Ahmet, Ahmet, can you hear me?
Yes, your voice and video is clear, very clear. Please.
Excellent. Are we still waiting for a couple of panelists to join? I see Ibrahim Al-Zubi, Peter Smith. Hello, morning Ibrahim, morning Peter.
Good morning. Good afternoon from Dubai. How are you?
Yeah, good afternoon. We've just made it there. We're all very good here. I'm very much enjoying this conversation this morning. It's been fascinating stuff. It's been superb. Hello, Dr. Nasser. Nice to have you with us.
Hey, hi. A bit complicated.
Not to worry. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. I think we have now gone live. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a fascinating discussion so far this morning, and there's been plenty of food for thought. And I'm looking forward to the next 90 minutes or so when we discuss climate finance in the MENA region and the challenges and opportunities that arise therefrom. It's a real pleasure to be hosting this particular panel with an esteemed and august group of panelists from across the region and representing a broad swathe of market participants and stakeholders in this vitally important area of discussion. I shall briefly introduce myself, and then I will introduce each of the panelists, and then I will give a brief introduction as to what we intend to discuss this morning before we get to the discussions. Well, my name is Matthew Eskrit, and I'm a partner in the banking and restructuring team at Pins & Masons in Dubai, and have been in the region for some 10 years now, and working on a whole range of financing projects. But one of the features of my practice over the last couple of years has been the increasing prevalence of renewable energy in that mix, and of course the growing interest in ESG, green finance, and sustainability-linked finance. With me today on the panel, we have Mr. Peter Smith, who is Head of Policy and Strategy at the Dubai Financial Services Authority. He is Head of Strategy and policy and joined the DFSA in 2012. He's currently responsible for overseeing the regulator's strategic planning, its annual business planning cycle, and it has a particular interest in ESG matters and is instrumental in preparing the discussion papers on the matters that we are discussing today. We also have today Mr. Ahmed Kuchuk, who is Minister of Finance for Fiscal Policies and Institutional Reform in Egypt. He has been in that role since March 2016, and he has been playing a leading role in designing and implementing Egypt's macroeconomic policies and reforms, especially fiscal and debt policies. And I look forward to discussing in some detail with him his experiences on Egypt's groundbreaking green sukuk from 2020. I also have here Mr. Ibrahim Al-Zubi, who is Chief Sustainability Officer for Majid Al Futtaim Holding. In his current role, Ibrahim oversees the group-wide sustainability strategy of Majid Al Futtaim and is in charge of raising the company's sustainability profile in the Middle East and indeed globally. And one of his top priorities is to develop and drive the company's net positive sustainability strategy across the company's different business units. And it's great to have Majid Al Futtaim here because they are certainly one of the prime movers in this space in the ESG market in the last 2-3 years. And as Daniel Hanna was mentioning in his keynote earlier, this is absolutely essential that we have these first movers who effectively set the agenda and set the strategy for the Middle East going forward. And finally, and last but not least, and you will have heard him with his very interesting introduction and keynote this morning, we have Dr. Nasser Saidi, who is chairman of the CEBC, and he holds a number of directorships and board roles, including deputy chairman of Eureka Capital. He's a member of the IMF's Regional Advisory Group for MENA, a co-chair for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and is an expert in corporate governance, and is also a member of the advisory board of OMFIF. So we look forward to having his insights on a range of issues as we proceed with our discussion. This morning's discussions to date have been very wide-ranging and have given us a good deal of food for thought. Daniel Hanna's keynote a few minutes ago in particular gave certain sobering statistics in terms of the region's readiness for this momentous move that we all have to take, whether we like it or not. But at the same time, he left us with a good deal of room for optimism. And I hope in our discussion, we will come to a conclusion that there is a way through, and there is a way, and the panelists will be able to demonstrate the basis on which we can make that progress. I thought I would just start briefly by suggesting in a few words why this topic is quite so important for all of us listening. And briefly, what's at stake? There's a very interesting report that was commissioned by the British government, known as the Dasgupta report, which basically and very glaringly gives us a very simple truth, and that the solution that we need to achieve is starting with the accepting a simple truth that our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it. And protecting nature needs to become more valuable than exploiting it. And we need to embed institutional arrangements that protect public goods, such as our oceans and the rainforests. And how we measure success needs to change. And nature needs to enter our economic and finance decision-making in the same way that buildings, machines, roads, and human skills need to. And our global financial system is critical to supporting a more sustainable engagement with nature. And we need to build a financial system that channels financial investment towards economic activities that enhance our stock of natural assets and encourages sustainable production and consumption. And it's clear to us, and as has been demonstrated on the previous panels, governments, central banks and regulators, international corporates and financial institutions all have a role to play in the transition to a more sustainable future. And I think, as I'm sure Ibrahim will be telling us, there's also increasing pressure on the private sector to be more purposeful and responsible in the way that they operate. And he will be able to talk to us about the concrete steps that their business is taking to achieve those goals. As has been mentioned, the MENA region is acutely exposed to many of the risks associated with climate change. And there's, notwithstanding the fact that there's some doubt as to the readiness of some of the economies of this region. And of course, it is a very diverse region with very wealthy OECD members and less wealthy members who are making great strides, but with more meager resources. But there's a general recognition amongst governments, regulators and other market participants that the region should be and needs to assume a leadership role in transitioning towards a net zero future. And indeed, I think that's been demonstrated by the fact that Abu Dhabi is pitching for the COP28 summit. And it's, I think, incredibly important that this region becomes the center of that discussion as we proceed forward with our goals. And I think we've seen steady growth in green and sustainability linked products amongst market participants in recent years. And both debt products and indeed debt capital markets instruments are represented in that mix. You've seen the large lenders like FAB issuing green sukuks. You've obviously seen MAF issuing one, maybe two sukuks, in fact, and they were the market movers on that for the region with their 2019 issuance. And you've seen also a steady growth in sovereign issuances. And indeed, as we're going to discuss with Ahmed, Egypt issued a 750 million bond only last year. What has this been driven by? Of course, there's a variety of factors that are in play here. There's the growing importance of ESG considerations generally. I think there's also a desire to mitigate reputational risk. And frankly, there's also increased reporting and regulatory oversight. And let's be honest, there is also a commercial opportunity. And that is one of the things that I think we need to focus on as one of our discussion points. And these are the things I think that I would like to sort of highlight and people to have in mind when we're having this discussion is some of the key themes today. I think first and most importantly, inaction creates risks for the financial sector. I mean, as we've said, climate, the real economy, financial system are fundamentally interlinked, and we need to focus on this. Transition to net zero is a commercial opportunity to be seized, as well as being the right thing to do. A business which invests today will benefit from the transition to a more sustainable economy. And consumers and investors are becoming more climate aware, and this is increasingly affecting their spending and investment decisions. And divestment only solutions are not a practical route to net zero. The FI sector will have to help steward a transition through an orderly economy-wide transition so that you don't get the problem of stranded assets and you don't have the wider economic impacts of unemployment and loss of jobs that will lead to weakening of economies that will obviously impact their ability to fight and make these transitions. We're going to talk about the supervisory expectations on banks and financial institutions. And I think, as Daniel Hanna has said, and indeed Standard Chartered Bank has said a couple of times on this panel discussion to date, banks are expected to enhance their approaches to managing financial risks. And they're going to need to gather information from their clients about their exposures to and their management of climate-related risks and opportunities. And I think there's also going to be increasing focus on investor stewardship and the importance of disclosure, because asset owners, asset managers need to be able to make informed decisions about where to invest and maintain proactive oversight of those assets. And that sort of effective stewardship will encourage transition to net zero. And disclosure of climate risks is absolutely critical for consumers, businesses, investors, and policymakers so that they can make the right decisions. And I think it's inevitable that climate disclosure is likely to become one of the mandatory disclosures in the near future, as Dr. Saidi was saying earlier this morning. But this isn't a straightforward matter, as Peter will no doubt be telling us, because the problem we face globally is that there's no comprehensive and consistent taxonomy. And this does need to be developed together with global sustainability standards, which feeds into, obviously, the importance of independent verification and certification. So there's a lot to get through, and we're not, obviously probably not going to solve all of these problems today, and we may not even be able to touch upon every single matter. But I'd like to sort of start with you, Peter. I mean, as from the regulator's perspective, I mean, you're primarily concerned with the impact of climate change on the economy and the financial system, and your job is to protect investors and market integrity. I mean, from your perspective, how are you seeing the development of the regulatory piece in the Middle East? And is it something that you think that the UAE is leading, and how much further do we need to go?
That's quite an interesting first question to start with. So thanks, Matthew, and thanks to the CEBC for inviting me to take part in this annual summit. Grateful for the opportunity. You're absolutely right, Matthew, that many of the things you've just mentioned, taxonomies, disclosures, verification methods, and so on, all require some sort of regulatory angle to it. It's not necessarily a regulatory angle that's going to come from organizations like ourselves, the DFSA. Some of it will come from political level regulators of the European Commission and organizations of that sort. Some of it will come from the supranational organizations. What's clear is that the Middle East is becoming increasingly active, I think, in this area. I think the UAE has taken some significant steps from a regulatory perspective and is keen to take more serious steps on just about all the fronts that you've mentioned already. The various things have already happened with declarations and so on. The Dubai Declaration in 2018, Abu Dhabi Declaration in 2019. I'm sure I got my years wrong there. The guiding principles that the UAE regulators group issued in early last year is an important step forward, and we've done further work on the back of that, including a survey conducted by all the regulators, the 5 of us who are in that group, as well as the markets in the UAE and a number of other participants, including the Ministry of Climate Change and the Environment. And so I think at the moment there's still information gathering and thoughts about what can be done and what can be done at the UAE level and what needs to be done at a broader level. I think everyone on the panel would accept that although countries can take sensible steps, real steps have to be broader than that. They have to be at least regional and ideally global. If you make the comparison with accounting standards, which is an obvious area to make a comparison with, we have 2 or 3 very large pools of accounting standards, and we need, as a minimum, in my view, to get to that place in the ESG space as well, and we're still a long way to go. Conscious that everybody else will have comments on those things and others. I'll stop there, Matthew, but I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those points later.
No, that's been really interesting, and thank you for those insights, Peter. I mean, I think that ultimately what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, there's only so much that individual countries, individual regulators can do to encourage these sorts of good behaviors, and that we are increasingly dependent upon international action and international decisions that will effectively allow us to ensure that there is a level playing field as much as anything else to assess climate compliance. Because I think, let's be honest, the other concern that we all face is that these need to be genuine steps. These need to be important transition linked and sustainability linked steps that will make measurable differences to the goals that we're trying to achieve. And this should not just be viewed as a marketing game or greenwashing, to use the more derogatory term. I mean, if you don't mind, Peter, I do want to sort of focus perhaps a little bit more on the regulatory sides just for the moment. But I mean, from my perspective, I guess I've got sort of two questions for you. The first relates to sort of transparency, and from your perspective, how does one go about promoting reliable and consistent disclosure in the marketplace, just in general terms?
I mean, I think there's a very simple answer and the complicated reality, isn't there? The simple answer is we get consistent disclosure by all mandating consistent and sensible standards, and then policing whether those standards are better or not. So that's the easy bit. The more difficult bit is actually getting from where we are now to that point. And obviously, transparency in the ESG space and in the climate finance space has progressed down a number of paths. There are a number of competing options out there. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the CDP Worldwide, the TCFD disclosures. There's a number of competing options out there. The EU has put in place two directives and is looking at extending that further, some of which those came into force in March of this year. So as we stand today, we have a fragmented and inconsistent position globally and across regions indeed. We see coalitions forming, some of them, for example, in Southeast Asia under existing organizations, ASEAN. We see the European Union having set up the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is theoretically open to just about anybody as a way of trying to bring together thinking on this. But so I think from our position as a regulator, the recent developments from the IFRS are important with the proposed establishment of an International Sustainability Standards Board, because it is something that has to be done on a supranational level. And that ISSB's task to develop a common sustainability related reporting standard, which will obviously build on the private sector initiatives and the public sector initiatives that have obviously taken place, is, I think, a crucial step in the right direction, and likely to be very, very impactful into the medium term. A prototype was set out in December of last year, which is supported by many of the significant players, both private and public, and hopefully that provides the foundations for that International Sustainability Standards Board to move forward and deliver something that is absolutely necessary. Clearly, as with anything of this sort, there will be much politicking and debate, and Ahmed is probably better placed to comment on that than I am. But there will inevitably be politics involved, and people will choose to push particular self-interest angles. But we can only hope, sitting where we do, that the prevailing need for common standards in all our common good will outweigh those, if I can call them, minor political points and angles that people will no doubt wish to push. So I think on transparency, reliable and consistent disclosure can only emerge when there are consistent and sensible standards in place and mechanisms for policing them.
That's fascinating, and I guess that sort of kind of already answers to some degree my second question, which was more about trust, and how does one, as a regulator, because you can't force, you have to encourage, you have to push, you have to sort of effectively provide the software, the framework for the right sorts of, to encourage the right sorts of behaviors. But how does a regulator push the market to deliver products that genuinely meet investors' sustainability preferences? And I mean, I suppose the corollary of that is, will we go from doing the right thing to mandatory at some point?
I think in most of these areas, in most jurisdictions, we will move either directly from do the right thing to mandatory, or through the slightly longer sequence of do the right thing, stop 2 on the journey, comply or explain, stop 3 on the journey, mandatory. So I think there are those two routes that people will choose depending on their preferences. I mean, I think the financial services industry generally produces products that meet at least meet enough of their investors' preferences, I think is the right way to put it. They may not meet all of their investors' preferences, but they meet enough of their investors' preferences for investors to actually buy them. If they didn't meet any of the preferences, existing preferences, then nobody would ever buy anything, would they? So you're not starting with a completely blank sheet of paper. But nonetheless, I do think some of the preferences are expressed differently and need to be tested differently in the ESG space than in the, let's say, retirement planning space or whatever other area you want to talk about. I think for us as regulators, a part of it comes back again to making sure that the labels are right. So disclosure to some extent. Do the labels actually describe the contents accurately? The question of what the contents actually are, I think we're more likely to leave to third-party verification, and independent verification, which you've already referred to, rather than dive deeply into the contents ourselves. But the way those contents are described is very much a matter of interest for regulators. And the only way we can build trust that investors' preferences will be met, particularly as the new generation, the millennial investors and so on, who have strong preferences in this area, come into the market. The only way we can build trust is by walking the walk. We can all talk the talk, we've all done lots of that, no doubt, but we've got to walk the walk as well. You've got to actually put products out there. Ibrahim's got to issue a bond, Ahmed's got to issue a bond, and it's got to do what it says. The processes have to be demonstrably used for the things that the investors think it's going to be used for. And people will be able to see that through verification or some other methodology. And the only way you can build trust, and I think it's a challenge for everyone, because no doubt there will be people in various parts of the world who will see this as an opportunity for less well-motivated actions, if I can put it that way, or fraud, or whatever you want to call it. There will be that. And so we've got the usual quite fragile balance between trying to build investor trust in a new market, which is obviously what we all want to happen. But doing that in a way where there is enough transparency, enough information that people can look back and say, yes, Majid Al Futtaim does what it says it will do when it issues a green bond. Sorry, Ibrahim, I'm not picking on you, but it's an obvious example. But people have to be able to answer that question. They have to be able to stand up at an annual general meeting or in an annual report and say, in our sustainability report, we issued 3 green bonds. This is what we did with them. Bang, bang, bang. And you've got to be, and that's got to be tested and verified. And all we can hope for is that the majority of things that are tested and verified are proved to be correct, and do what they said they would do. So, and our regulators have a role to play in that, but so do investors and other parties as well. The point you made earlier about, investor action in this area is really crucial.
No, I absolutely think that's vital to all of this. And I think that don't take this seriously are going to start paying a price in due course, and in terms of their cost of funding, indeed the availability of funding. I want to turn to Ibrahim here, and thank you, Peter. We could spend an awful lot of time talking about a lot of these issues, but obviously we've got a lot to get through. And turning to Majid Al Futtaim, Ibrahim. So as I said, we've seen increasing interest amongst market participants in sustainability-linked products and a slew of corporate issuances in the last 2 or 3 years. And you as a company led by example with your first corporate benchmark Green Sukuk in 2019. And you've also been a first mover in integrating ESG objectives into your governance, your company strategy, and the risk management procedures. And you've made very public your promise and commitment to that net positive strategy of 2014. If I can just ask you a very open, obvious question. So what is driving MAF to do this?
First of all, thank you very much for CEBC and everyone for this very interesting discussion. First of all, as a sustainability practitioner, it's music to my ears when to listen to yourself, Peter, and of course what Ahmed will mention and Dr. Nasser, because it makes a lot of sense when it comes out of you guys, not from a sustainability practitioner, that it does make financial sense. What you've been describing from a regulator or from what Daniel as well mentioned from banking, it is the new business model. It's the sustainable business model that everyone talks about, even the green comeback post-COVID-19. So last year, if we look at it, it's been a very tough year. It's a very different year, but it's exposed the deep underlying problems that we have in be it public crisis management systems or inequalities. And as much it was challenging, we've seen an acceleration in business consciousness, a trend that was already underway even before the pandemic. The companies now, private sector, and management team is part of it. We are reevaluating our organization's sense of purpose and feeling the need to address social, environmental, as well as economic issues. So we've seen a shift of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and it is well underway. So the environmental awareness is not about it's a nice thing to do. It's about creating a resilience and agility in our new business model. Having said that, the journey of sustainability of Masdar started 10 years ago, and why that time decided to do that through different internal stakeholder engagement that I've been running. 5 main reasons. 1, access to capital, cost savings, long-term profitability. So this is what we like to hear, and I'm sure that all the banking, everyone in the business like to hear, but also it's also brand reputation. We've seen a shift in the population, global population. Let's say talk about the MENA population, which made more than 50% under the age of 30 years old. They want to work for a sense of purpose companies. They want to buy from sustainably led companies. So brand reputation is a main thing, one of the drivers. And the 5th one, of course, corporate citizenship. Like we are part of what's going on. And I think what COVID-19 showed that we were right when it came to that. If one falls, we all fall. So that's for maybe health. But let me tell you something. Climate change is a pandemic. We always believed it's a pandemic. I believe it is so far it's the pandemic that we've been living in. Look around, look at the droughts, look at the water force, look at what geopolitical things happening in our region. So what we looked at it that time, we believe that climate change will have an impact on our vision, which is creating great homes for everyone every day, as well as it will have a business impact. So we've decided to look into integrate this into our risk and opportunities and compliance as well. We predicted what a good future will look like, what government consciousness will look like, and they may implement regulations such as the green building regulations, such as labor, human rights, diversity and inclusion, you name it. And we've decided to come up with, look at the next 25 years and integrate sustainability in every single decision we do and we take as an organization. Having said that, through the journey for the last 10 years and going forward from our net positive commitment, I believe the best thing I personally did with work within the organization is working with our treasury and finance team. Because I stopped talking to the boards. I stopped talking external because the board they believed in it. We have top-down, bottom-up approach, but we started going out to investors and having access to capital because we included sustainability. Now, what Peter mentioned, and I about regulation, about transparency, about reporting, by the way, it's there. It's just was about a matter of investors, banking, regulators, and getting a pilot. And the good thing about this, and I think if MAF were Egypt, and among other organizations within the region, what we proved that it can be done, and it should be the way forward. We shouldn't go back to the normal business, which is the investors, the bonds. We should look at green bonds. We should look at ESG related loans. We should look at green loans, green financing. That should be the new norm if we want to mitigate the future, the impacts of climate change, which we all agree that it is impacting us. Last but not least, the whole world, the whole governments of the world decided to integrate and give commitments on the SDGs. And people don't talk a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals. And by the way, I'm sure maybe Daniel or some of the colleagues of the banking stakeholders, they can talk about SDGs related bonds as well. SDGs are one of the main common language that public sector and private sector talks. Our sustainability strategy aligns directly with 10 of the 17 SDGs, which became the translator of our work within the government. When we go on outreach, we talk to government, public sectors, intergovernmental organizations, financial institutions. So we have clear KPIs related to SDGs, related to sustainability, and aligned with the business objectives, which again made a lot of business sense. It brought us more customers. It brought us, there is a return on investment, there is cost savings, as well as we are practicing our role as part of the community. It's a win-win for us, good for the community, the environment, and good for the business.
That's fantastic, Ibrahim, and thank you very much for explaining so lucidly why MAF has taken this road. And just forgive me for focusing on this, but can you just give me one concrete example of how your business processes have changed, and one example of what opportunities you have seen for the business following from embedding ESG principles into the DNA of your business?
Absolutely. Let's start when we said not even one decision we take relates to sustainability. So we have an investment and a sustainable checklist when we acquire anything, either be it a land or decide on a business. Let's talk about a shopping mall, for example. We introduced the checklist for our business development teams and research and intelligence unit when it comes to development team. They go through the checklist to ensure that, one, we will achieve the shopping malls, the development and project management team will achieve their target when it comes to the green sustainable building policy, which is building LEED Gold certified. Also, then they look at the labor conditions, which as per our human rights and employee accommodation policy, that tier 1, that we did not impact the human rights, we did not impact employee conditions, did we create jobs or not, did we achieve our socio-economic impact criteria, as well as investment internally in on-site generations for renewables, or partnering with national and local startups for off-site generation. So this all can be done way before through the due diligence process of our project investments, which will create jobs, will help the economy, as well as will achieve our green building targets. The other part I can give you an example of, which means when it comes to the social part, the socio-economic, creating jobs, but also we look at diversity and inclusion. We look at the commitments, which how many jobs we created, what kind of gender equality we had, did we do localization, did we achieve our localization targets or not, did we support the investing with the governments in infrastructure, and how much we invested in infrastructure, how many people benefited outside our project, or how many people will benefit of outside this project of this. A good example, if you live in Dubai, the flyover of Mall of the Emirates that we invested on the bridge created what we know now as Barsha, as Big Barsha, for example, which is a huge neighborhood now, initially triggered by building a Mall of the Emirates, as well as the investing in the infrastructure, either it's a bridge or a flyover when it comes to infrastructure. So that's one part. The other part is we look at the overall sustainability targets. So which is it gets audited externally every quarter, gets assured as well. So when it comes to clean audited data for the last couple of years, these overall targets, we have a percentage that goes to the C-suite N-1 on the overall that the company must achieve, and it goes into their remuneration. That's what we do. Now, when it comes to ESG, by the way, we have rating by third party, as Peter mentioned, by Sustainalytics, and MSCI. We're rated as A by MSCI and low risk by Sustainalytics. When it goes to ESGs, of course, it goes to the different governance, social, and environmental part, and it's publicly listed. It's third-party opinion. It's there on the website, along with data and reports for the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you. And just that's fantastic. And just picking up something that Daniel Hanna said in his keynote a few minutes ago. I mean, how is MAF encouraging its business partners and its supply chain to adopt similar practices in their own businesses? Because presumably that's one of the things that we were discussing in the previous panel discussion, which is the sort of the viral spread of good behaviors and the right thing to do. And people like Majid Al Futtaim, who have the sort of foresight and also, to be honest, the management direction and indeed the financial resources to lead by example. How do you encourage your business suppliers and your supply chain to follow suit?
Awareness, engagement, and policies. So what we do, because I've mentioned that this should be the norm. So what we've done is we started engaging with our tier 1 supply chain to start with on different topics. Our first topic was 10 years ago in the GCC employee accommodation. And we worked with them on a voluntary basis how we can integrate the ILO and the local regulations as a minimum within our Majd Futtaim standards. Now we have a sustainable procurement policy, a sustainable supply chain policy when it comes to the sustainability policy that the supply chain have, procuring locally and regionally, procuring environment friendly, and procuring with human rights standards as well. So now, after a couple of years working and engaging with awareness and everything, if any supply chain would like to work with Majd Al Futtaim, they have to implement and apply our sustainable procurement and supply chain policy, which, by the way, we audit on a quarterly basis. And if they don't comply, they simply lose the contract as per the contracts we have with them. So we went beyond asking a simple question, which, by the way, can make a big difference. Asking the supply chain, do you have a sustainability statement, which I think everyone should ask. But also, we started in education, engagement, and working with them, not only with our supply chain, but also with our tenants. So, for example, we work with all our tenants as free of charge consultants on the Sustainable Fit Out Guide. We help them to achieve a star rating fit out, and I'm glad we have Ahmed. For example, in our Mall of Egypt, our supply in Egypt, and all of them Egyptian companies, they achieved a full 5-star rating when it comes to sustainable fit out in our food court. So the food court in Mall of Egypt, with all the F&B outlets, working with our partners, tenants, they achieved the highest rating when it comes to sustainability, which means water reduction, carbon reduction, as well as engaging awareness for their own staff. And that's the norm now. That's the policy. You want to open a shop with us, minimum you need to achieve 3-star rating in our shopping centers, wherever we are.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Mr. Kuchuk, Ahmed, if I could turn to you in Egypt, if that's all right. And thank you for your patience. It's been fascinating so far to hear the views of Peter and Ibrahim, and I'm looking forward to hearing your own experiences in the context of the Egyptian approach. Now, as I've said earlier, I mean, we've seen sovereign green bond issuance soar in 2020, which in and of itself is a very positive development, and I think we should all be excited about that. And I think that there is reason to be quietly optimistic that that direction of travel will continue. And it's great to see that Egypt became the first Arab country to issue a green bond last year for $750 million deal. And I think it's very clear that it flags your commitment as a government to sustainability and also to diversifying your investor base. And the proceeds of that issuance are going to be used to finance green projects in sectors such as transportation, renewable energy, and indeed energy efficiency. Now, if I can also ask you an open question to begin, and just very general terms, what are the key learning experiences for you and for your government from this debt issuance?
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for also all the participants today, including Daniel, and the keynote speech was very interesting remarks. Peter and Brahim also gave us a lot of different dimensions from the regulatory point of view, as well as from the private sector point of view, and very, very interesting developments. And I think what I want to say to address your question is that this is a very important topic: sustainability, climate change, dealing with all the challenges arising from that. It's a collective effort, and we all have a big part to play with it: the government, the private sector, the regulatory bodies, all the international financial institutions, the regional institutions. It's a very collective effort, and unless we all join efforts, it's not easy. Especially after COVID, you will find a lot of more challenges for a lot of countries and governments and private sector, and you're adding additional challenges to already a very existing or very high aspiration for the people in the region. So it's very important to keep this in mind. My second point: what are the lessons learned? There are a lot to be shared, but let me tell you two things. That first of all, there are two different aspects. There is the willingness and the commitment, but there is also the ability of delivering, and it's very similar to what Peter said: talking the talk and walking the walk. It's the two are very important. You will not walk unless you have a certain direction or certain decision to move in that direction. But also, the process and your journey is a very learning process, and you learn a lot. You will not be able to learn the full cycle and get the full experience unless you start implementing and start working on the ground and start delivering. So it's very important to have these two concepts in place. I think in our case, for us to have the ability to do and to deliver and to issue our first sovereign green bond was a journey that preceded a lot of efforts, including repricing our energy mix in the right way, that led to a big reduction in the consumption of gasoline and other fuel products that we want to limit. There was also a big investment by the government in renewables. Just for you to understand the significance of what I'm saying, Egypt, the share of renewables in electricity generation was less than 1% only 7 or 8 years ago. Now we're talking about 11% in 2019, 12% in 2019, and we are approaching the 20% by the end of 2022, June 2022. And our target now is to take this to around 35%, to around 40% by 2035. This is commitment announced by the government, but not only a commitment, this is commitment, and now we are seeing delivery and we're seeing an achievement there. A lot of the upgrade in the infrastructure and streamlining what's there. So there was a lot of preparatory work for us to go and deliver. It's not only the ability and the soul, it's the willingness and to have a lot of work. So one thing that we have learned from this process is that we need to bring everybody around the table. we need to a lot of preparatory work is needed. You need to have the right partner with you. You need to choose the right partners. It's not an easy process. It's something that you want to do, but it's not an easy process. So you need to have the partners, but you need to have the story. So for the story to be there, you need the partners, and you need to do that. So one thing that we have maybe did well in that regard is that we have created this interministerial committees that allow us to sit together, discuss things, collect the information, debate things in a very easy and in a very open environment. And it's a learning curve and a learning experience. And again, bringing the right partners with you facilitate this, enable you to better understand the process, better understand the challenges, and also give you solutions and options. So it's a very collective effort, but it's also require commitment and require walking the walk, as being said, because unless we do that, we will always be shying from facing those challenges and really putting our extra effort toward that direction.
Thank you, Ahmed. That's very interesting insights that you shared with us in the context of the motivations and the drivers that have driven this exciting development. And yeah, it's extraordinary and also very exciting to see how quickly things that seemed impossible only 10 or 15 years ago, which was a sizable contribution of renewables to the energy mix in this region, have so quickly changed. And that, for me, is an object lesson into what we have to sort of is in what is actually possible. And it's very easy to sort of give up and say things are not going to be achievable. But I think what we're seeing, actually, we put our minds to something with sufficient focus and drive and determination, and that journey will begin. Now, from my perspective, one question that I had furthered was that, I mean, how would you, I mean, I hope it's a question that you can answer, but from the point of view of investor engagement, I mean, how was it different in the context of this green debt issuance? And I mean, did you achieve your goal of diversifying your investor base in consequence and source of funding?
Absolutely. Of course, we have leveraged our very strong team that is with me in this room that has been engaging with investors for the last years. But this transaction, the green bond transaction specifically, which is, by the way, is only a milestone transaction, but this means that we have a very good ambition plan for the next years, and this will be part of our normal issuances, not only from the government perspective, but also from the private sector perspective. We did this transaction. One of the main achievements, or one of the main reasons, is to create a benchmark for the private sector in Egypt, as well as for other government entities in Egypt to explore this option. But coming to your question, the transaction itself paid off tremendously. Yes, we did a lot of effort, pre-issuance to deal and to talk to investors in a very open way to address their questions, their inquiries, and in a very transparent way. We didn't say that we have everything right and that all our ambitions are there, but also we were able to show them a story that says that proves that Egypt in 5 or 6 years was able to make big achievements, supported by numbers, supported by figures, and supported by reality. They can come and see, and it's not only government statements, it's the reality on the ground, backed by outcomes. And out of that, we were able to bring, for the first time, we had, of course, a very strong coverage. We have four times coverage in our bond issuances, in our green bond issuance, but and we were able also to bring the cost compared to even our secondary market prices at that time. But also we were able to bring 16 new investors for the first time to invest in our international bond issuances, and we are a regular bond issuer. So to bring this number, it means that those are investors that came because of the green bond issuance or the labeling or the instrument itself. And we were able also to bring larger number of existing investors, but they came through their also sustainable arm or sustainable funds, dedicated funds. So overall, yes, there was more investors coming to Egypt. We have widened our investor base. We were able to have a very strong coverage, and we were able to bring Egypt to on the radar of this very growing and sophisticated investor base globally. So yes, even from a debt management perspective, there was a lot of success and a lot of achievements for us that is worth all the effort that was done, as well as that's being done now to maintain the communication with the investors.
Thank you, Ahmed. And I think that's for me an object lesson in the attractiveness and the appetite for these products. The fact that you were oversubscribed and that you've effectively tapped into a whole new source of funding in the context of these instruments. And it suggests to me, therefore, that you see as a country, as a government, rich opportunities going forward for green and sustainability-linked issuances.
Correct. There is a lot that we can do and a lot we can benefit from. And we are working now even on a broader perspective on the sustainability development financing. And there is a lot of innovative tools and financing that is there that can help countries bridge the gap between their aspirations and the existing financing that will enable that. But again, as I told you, also we have to keep in mind that this is not a process that you can deliver without real work on the ground. So it's a collective effort, and the awareness and the engagement with our government counterparts is key. Because I mean, for us to do a regular issuances, whether from even the private sector or the government, we need pipeline, we need more projects, we need more work on the ground, we need to have more delivery. And so things that's done by the private sector, like El Futem, which is doing great in Egypt and doing a lot of work here also, and all the learning that they are doing to the suppliers, our regulatory bodies also that is now engaging. We even in the government now in our budget, in our own budget, we have at least 20% of all our investment or projects financed by the budget have now what they call it. They are all have met all the criteria that we have set. We have issued a manual that give more privilege and more. I would say not privilege, that enable the government to give more weight for projects that would fit also all the sustainability indicators, and for those projects we give them priority in our financing and funding. And also now we have almost more than 1/5 of our whole budget capital projects financed by the budget are also fitting or eligible to this criteria. So we will put more and more weight there, and hopefully by doing that, all of us together, we will be in a much better position in the next years.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you indeed for those insights. Dr. Saidi, if I can turn to you, and thank you again for your patience in the context of this discussion. It's been fascinating that we've heard from the regulator, we've heard from the private sector, and we've also heard from a government, a major government in the Middle East, and the steps that they're taking to head down this very important road. Now, we've talked, I think, on a number of occasions this morning and indeed this afternoon about the importance of the financial sector in facilitating this transition, and particularly banks as one of the primary stores of capital in the financial system. I mean, they are, let's face it, going to be essential in facilitating that transition to net zero and ensuring ESG goals are embedded into businesses that they support. And in the absence of a bank, and apologies if I'm putting you on the spot here, but I just wonder from your own perspective how you think banks can best use that very important leverage that they have to encourage the growth of green and as Daniel said earlier, importantly, transition finance and sustainability linked finance. What in your view can banks do? And
I think the financial tools, along with the fiscal tools, are probably going to be the critical tools that will drive us along the path of decarbonization. And let me explain. If you think about the fiscal tools to begin with, because those are critical, you need to think about how you're going to be pricing carbon risk, right? That is the essential thing. At the moment, we are not adequately pricing carbon risk. We're not taking it into account in our business decisions or even in our private household decisions. So what you need to do, of course, is to recognize those risks and price them accordingly. And the market will head in that direction. We need to help it. And one way to help it, of course, is through a carbon tax. So one thing on the agenda for all of us, for all countries, but particularly in this part of the world where we continue to subsidize fossil fuels, is to shift away from fossil fuel subsidies to begin with, phasing out, but then deliberately introduce a carbon tax. Once you introduce a carbon tax, automatically the prices of inputs as well as outputs that have a large carbon content are going to increase. That's going to affect your markets, it's going to affect your trade, it's going to affect the whole supply chain automatically. So a carbon tax, a fiscal tool, is going to be extremely important. But the other one, and the reason why it becomes so important is that it is automatic. You don't need to tell somebody you have to do something. The price takes care of it. The market price takes care of it. But the other side, I think, is what Peter was talking about and the markets and the banks. Here, I think the role will be critical. And if I want to compare it to anything, it'll be similar to what we've done with corporate governance. Initially, corporate governance was thought of, well, that's a nice thing to have, right? I mean, it's good for your reputation. You'll have a couple of more women on boards. You'll have some NEDs. You'll have some more disclosure, transparency, etc. All the paraphernalia of corporate governance. It was good to have. And you were deemed to be a good corporate citizen, etc. But then we discovered that during the great financial crisis, that corporate governance risk is market risk. And that if you have a failure of a major bank or financial institution, that hits the whole banking and financial system. We learned that at a great expense. Remember, it was the biggest
forces and so on. So that would be the first thing. But the second thing is, and I think this probably comes more from what Ibrahim and Ahmed have said, is I would say to market participants, get on the train or it's going to leave you behind because there's already a lot of activity going on. As Dr. Nasser, I think, was just starting to say, there's going to be more pushing and forcing to get you on the train. So get on the train now while you still can. And you can then learn and get up this learning curve that we all need to get up more quickly than perhaps the 10 years that Majid Al Futtaim have been working on this. And I think it's everyone has a part to play to this, all market participants in different ways. And I think it's important that we all recognise that and that we all step up and help to address these challenges. But I say I am optimistic.
So, thank you, Peter. Dr. Saidi, yes, I think you're back. We're live.
Just pointing to the fact that the banks and the markets are going to have a critical role to play, and I was comparing it to corporate governance, which went through different stages. A nice thing to have, then it was therefore purely voluntary, then comply or explain, and then mandatory. I think this is where we're going to be heading. But of course, the regulators set the standard, right? But it is the banks that are going to ensure compliance. So they're going to translate it down into requirements from their clients for the credits that they give, for the mergers and acquisitions that they finance, and across the whole banking spectrum. I think that's only one part. You need to prepare for that from now. What that means for businesses is you've got to have a framework already in place for decarbonizing yourself, your company. Just like Egypt and all other countries are going to have a decarbonization path, you have to have a decarbonization path for your own company. It needs to address the issues of policy and legal risks that you might have if you don't. Technology risks, because you take, for example, electric cars, they're going to be fully competitive with fossil fuel, with carbon emitting cars within 2 years, right? With internal combustion engines. You need to think about how the market itself is changing. Young people today are no longer going to accept what we accepted. They want a cleaner atmosphere. They want to have products and services that are compliant with carbon de-risking. And then you've got your own reputational risks of your products and of your company. So all of those will need to go into your framework. And your bank is going to be asking you questions about that. And if the bank does not do that, the bank itself will suffer. So what you're going to have is moving down the whole supply chain into the businesses across through the banking system. I think that is one component, but it's not the only component. The other component, I think, is financial markets. And here, I think two things are very interesting. If you look at total assets under management today, they're a little bit over 100 trillion. Some 50 trillion of that is now run by asset managers who have committed
It looks unfortunately like we may have lost Dr. Saidi again. So apologies for that, for the technical difficulties. Ibrahim, final word from you. I mean, if I could ask you for a key message that you would give to attendees here about your own experiences and MAF's experiences in this sector and what we should all be doing in that context.
Well, briefly, I fully agree with Peter. I think we're all aligned here. I think it's time for us to discuss the how and the opportunities, and that's what we should discuss. I'll leave you with the fact about the opportunities that we have. You know, the green bond market reached a new record as Q3 2020 issuance peaked at around $64 billion, the highest volume in any third quarter period since market inception. And that tells you a lot. It tells you the commitment, it tells you the market, it tells you the opportunities, and that where the world is going ahead. And I really like what Peter mentioned about the train. If you want to be part of a future, an existing and sustainable economy, there is no plan B. This is the only way to sustain your business and to be, and if you want, in the business atmosphere for the coming 10 to 15 years. And we heard from Ahmed from a government level that it does work. We've seen many examples from Daniel in today's panel. Now it's time to walk the walk and discuss on how not only how we can all achieve a net zero, how we can implement a strategy for green tech, how to create a post-COVID-19 sustainable economy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That's appreciated, and thank you for those insights. Dr. Saidi, are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I know technology isn't always a handmaiden.
It's fine. Just carry on where you left off. We've got a couple of extra minutes, so don't worry.
So let me point to the importance of the markets. I mentioned that 50 trillion now is in the hands of investors that want to look at decarbonization. So the market that Egypt tapped is going to be a market that's rapidly growing. So let's understand what is at stake. What is at stake is that the cost of credit to anything that is carbon heavy is going to be rising, right? So increasingly, banks, financial institutions will be cutting down investment in fossil fuel and carbon-heavy industries and businesses. So you need to prepare yourself for that. On the other side, I think, and this is where it's critically important, is the markets. The markets are going to put a premium on going for green new deals and blue new deals in terms of investing in new technologies. We've seen that in renewables. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a major transformation. Remember that it has to do with our transport sector, our buildings, our industry and manufacturing, the way we live. And therefore, we're going to have to commit enormous resources. And those are going to have to come through the financial markets, much less so than through the banks. The banks are going to be excellent for driving credit away from carbon heavy toward carbon light, right? But it's the markets where we need to put in the major effort. That's where you're going to have green development banks. That's why green bonds are sukuk are going to be critical. But at the same time, we need verification. We need verification. We need to be able to avoid greenwashing. I think that is a major issue. And therefore, the framework that you're going to have for disclosure is going to be a critical one. We're going to need something coming out of the BIS. We're going to need something coming out of IOSCO. And we're going to need IFRS, US GAAP, and all the others to provide the underlying accounting framework. If we don't have a comprehensive, agreed upon accounting framework, to measure the risks, see how they translate into the prices of assets, we're not going to get very far. So the accounting standards are going to be a bedrock, because no regulator is going to be able to issue standards for disclosure and all the rest if you don't know how to account for it. If you can't account, nobody's going to take it into account. So I think that is going to be critical. So what I'm saying is several things. Accounting standards is going to be important. Disclosure standards is another building block. What the regulators do, both for the banking and financial industry, but also for the markets, is going to be critical to drive us forward. But even then, I think what's probably going to drive it most forward is people, investors and people. And people's preferences are changing. We've already seen that. And I think COVID drove home that point, that you're exposed to pandemic risk, COVID risk, that can mean death for you. This message came very clear to people. And so they started protecting themselves. And it was self-protection, which was very important. Then you go on to crowd level protection, you get vaccines. We're not there yet for climate, but the mood is changing. So everybody is now much more aware of the carbon content of anything they're consuming, using, or investing in. I think that will drive the markets to provide more of those carbon neutral or light carbon products and services as we move along. And I think the beauty of it is that technology is already there. Technology is already there. Whether you're talking about the transport system, buildings, energy efficiency and the like, the technology is already there. However, I don't think we should pin all our hopes on the technology. It's nice to be optimistic, but our human animals, the human animal has always felt that technology is the answer to everything. Matthew, you started off by pointing to the Dasgupta report, and that's absolutely right. We're not the only animals on Earth. There are all the others, and biodiversity is what allows us to survive. If we don't have the bees, we are dead. That's to put it simply. So what you need to think of is not only what you're doing as a human animal, you need to think of natural capital. So I think what we're going to go into is saying, how do I use technology intelligently? How do I rebuild the natural capital that we've been destroying and applauding ourselves for high levels of GDP growth, whereas we've been depleting natural capital? We've been using, for example, our oil and gas, right? And we have high growth. But you've used an asset just like you've used your house and sold part of your house. Eventually, the floor is no longer there. So what I think we need to hope for is shift in preferences, but also using technology. And I think if I look at young people today, then I tend to be optimistic. But I wouldn't pin it all on technology. I think we need to change our behavior. I think that's critical. And the key to changing our behavior is, I think, pricing carbon. Whether you do it through a carbon tax, you do it through other forms, or you get your regulators to tell the banks, price it accordingly. Otherwise, you are at risk yourself, because the climate risks will translate into financial risks, and then you can have a major financial crisis. Just think of how much exposure banks have to the oil and gas industry, particularly in our region. If those assets start becoming stranded assets, then what you're talking about is a write-down of most of the wealth of our region. And that, I think, is a central message we need to be careful about. You have to start the transformation from now.
Thank you, Dr. Saadi, for these vitally important insights and absolutely essential observation that fundamentally we operate within nature, not without it, and that we need to engage much more sustainably with those assets, not just for our own good, but for the good of the generations that will follow us. And we are ultimately responsible for the world that we leave behind to our children, our grandchildren. And on that note, Ahmed, if I can just turn to you, because we are 1 minute left, Ahmed, because I want to just give you one final comment before we wrap up. In the context of what Dr. Saadi was saying, presumably you would agree, given your beautiful and history and the beauty of your natural world around in Egypt in particular, what we need to change ultimately is nature needs to get back into the heart of the way we make economic and financial decisions, doesn't it? And I think these instruments that we're talking about are helping us slowly but surely facilitate that journey.
Of course, this is the final outcome and the final the end result, and that's why it's very important that we streamline environmental and sustainable dimensions in our work, whether at the Ministry of Finance. We don't need all the system where you have one central way of ministry thinking about one and about this issue. The issue is that we can do a lot in every single dimension in our daily habits, in our daily work, in our daily development. So I think this is required that we streamline really in our daily work and in all dimensions of our work, private sector, government, financial institutions, international institutions, the environmental and the sustainable development perspective. And by doing that, this will itself create the right momentum and the right force for us to move in the right direction with the right speed.
Thank you, Ahmed, and we'll leave it there because we are certainly out of time. So thank you all to the participants for the fascinating insights that they have shared with us today. I don't know about you, but I've certainly learned a lot, and it's been a really productive discussion. And I think we end it with a degree of optimism for the journey ahead. And I think that's what we all need to hold on to. This is a soluble problem. We have the technology and we know what to do. It's just about changing behaviors at every level, both governmental, regulatory, and in terms of the private sector. But also, let's be honest, each and every one of us needs to think carefully about the steps that we can take ourselves to improve things. So thank you, CEBC, and I look forward to the remainder of the discussion. It's been fascinating so far. So thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much all the esteemed speakers who joined the panel. Very interesting. I have learned a lot as well. And thank you for everyone who is joining us today. So this concludes our first day of the summit. So please, now you can see the networking section is open. So you can spend, it will be open for the next 50 minutes. So please go there. You can network with other attendees. And also please make sure that you visit the virtual exhibition, which you can see on your left hand side as well of the screen. So we have some amazing partners who are available to answer your questions about the products and services as well. So please make sure to visit both the networking section and the exhibition as well. And we'll start tomorrow, the second day of the summit at 9:30 a.m. Gulf Standard Time, local time in the UAE. So thank you again, everyone, and see you tomorrow, and also in the networking section. Bye.